in order to mitigate this geopolitical risk, this technological surprise risk, we have to have a serious national plan for disclosure, for being increasingly transparent and having a more open, serious conversation about UAPs. Most people haven't been paying close attention, so it sounds kind of kooky. But if you've been paying close attention, you read the language and you listen to the statements made by some of our most senior national security officials and congressional, national leadership, they're as serious as a heart attack. I mean, this is like no joke.
Matthew Pines, welcome to London.
Thanks for having me.
How you doing?
Doing pretty well.
So, we're going to get into UAPs again today, but it's either a massive Psy-Op or it's real. My bias wants this all to be real. That's the bit I'm more interested in. And I would say over the last year, I'm definitely in this is more real. But I'm also in the world of those motherfuckers if this is a Psy-Op. I told you a story about my brother tricking me about aliens once, so I've been Psy-Op'd already on this shit. So that's where I am. Where are you in the whole kind of this is... Because you had this like percentage thing before.
Mm-hmm. Well, these are clearly real phenomenon. Even the government has said that. The question is, what underlying explanation do we think accounts for the most mysterious aspects of the phenomenon? And there I don't have like high credences in terms of any particular explanation. But I think it's very clear that there's something exotic, very unusual happening that we can't prosaically explain. And so that forces us into categories of explanation that we maybe have not historically treated very seriously. So that's like where I am. I think we are now in a position where we have to take those more exotic explanations very seriously.
Definitely real?
Yeah, definitely real. These are real objects displaying anomalous performance characteristics.
And none of that could be faked as part of a Psy-Op?
Well, there are certain technologies that we've had for a while that can fake or spoof detections in different sensor platforms. So this going back to like the 1960s of sort of spoofing Soviet radars, making them see sort of phantom detections of aircraft to manipulate their defense systems and try to confuse their strategic decision-making. That's sort of a long history of kind of deception and spoofing in especially electronic warfare. So that's clearly an investment area of priority for the US government and many other governments for many decades. I think in any particular case that you look at, especially if you're in the government, you have to assume that's a potential explanation, right? Are the Chinese essentially spoofing our sophisticated sensors? Do they have some capability to make us see things on a variety of different platforms that are not actually there? And I believe that those assessments have been done in many cases to sort of rule that out as a possibility. And what remains are sort of real physical objects.
So I think this is one of those big questions everyone has in life. I think it's probably, I would guess it's up there with the 4 or 5 most important questions in the world that like, are we alone? And I think during certainly my childhood, you would see certain reports, you would read about Roswell, but everything seemed to kind of like a little bit silly. Mm-hmm. The witness testimonies were usually somebody who felt like some farmer, some rancher who saw something. The photographic evidence now itself looks dated. It looks a little bit like the alien spaceships were designed back in the 40s, 50s, 60s, 70s when these things happened. And it was always kind of like, there was always like a UFO crowd who hoped these things were real. But it never felt real. Suddenly now it feels real and legitimate. And why is that now? What's changed? Because the reason I ask that is you go down the rabbit hole and they now start to look about things like, oh no, Roswell was real. And so there's a legitimacy that didn't exist before.
Yeah, I mean, there's been an official set of activities that you can look at starting, maybe 2017 with the release of those New York Times videos and a number of initial individuals coming out, Lou Elizondo, Christopher Mellon, et cetera, that kind of got this ball rolling in terms of the official process to try to break down some of the internal taboos that they felt were creating a sort of an air safety hazard, right? There were individuals inside the Navy in particular that were encountering these objects in the course of their official duties. And because the internal social taboo was so strong, they weren't officially reporting it. And so this was seen as just a basic operational hazard that needed to be addressed. And that grabbed the attention of some members of Congress, in particular in the Senate. And that kickstarted a series of amendments to the National Defense Authorization Act, kind of the principal authorizing language for all of our defense programs, that stood up a number of different reporting requirements and offices to take a harder look at this question and report back to Congress. And that has sort of been the sequence of sort of steps we've been taking for the past few years as Congress, especially a few members of the Senate, have asked questions, gotten answers. Some of those answers have not been satisfactory, so they put in more requirements, more strict reporting, and try to get to new questions that they feel like they don't have sufficient answers to. And so we've been in this sort of escalation of congressional interest, where every time they've sort of peeled back a particular onion, they've had more questions. So that's where we are now. Sort of the progression of those questions has gotten to the point where now they're asking very pointed questions about very specific things related to legacy programs that have been alleged to retrieve and reverse engineer, quote, technologies of unknown origin and biological materials. Those are definitions that they put into the bills that the Senate passed last year. And so that's kind of where we are now, right? It's now moved from kind of this social fiction, it's kind of taboo in historical imaginations and our sort of different narratives over the past several decades into an official focus of government investigation.
And how do these corridors of power work within U.S. government? Because it seems to me like there's secret departments, secret budgets, but who are these? Who are these secret departments? Where does their authorization come from? Where do their objectives come from? Which departments talk to which departments? Like, who's benefiting from this?
Yeah, I mean, there's a whole archipelago of official secrets. Different government agencies have different mission responsibilities and different authorizing either statutes or executive orders that determine what sorts of information is classified and to what level and what sort of degrees of protections it's afforded. If you zoom out, there are kind of two big buckets of secrecy. There's the Department of Energy, which has its own law, the Atomic Energy Act, which was its initial sort of formulation started to take shape in the late 1940s, but it's really in the early 1950s that it was codified. And it established a kind of whole separate regime for protecting our nuclear secrets, right? Both restricted data that we think about in terms of nuclear weapons design, as well as information we collect on foreign nuclear programs. That's sort of trans-classified foreign nuclear information. We also classify basic physics under Atomic Energy Act. So we can, within the Atomic Energy Act, there's certain information that's, quote, born secret, meaning it doesn't require any special designation by an original classification authority. If it meets the definitions of the statute, it is secret by definition. So any individual that just like a scientist that is discussing certain basic physics could be potentially violating that statute. And so that definition applies to, or that statute applies to a number of different things that it defines, including special nuclear material. So it sets up a whole arrangement of security clearances. The equivalent of top secret is called the Q clearance. And so if you work in the Department of Energy, the main subset of the Department of Energy that works on nuclear materials is the National Nuclear Security Administration, and they handle essentially our nuclear stockpile and make sure that the weapons are ready to give to the Defense Department for use in our platforms. So that's a whole architecture of secrecy. Within the Department of Energy, they also have their own special access program, so things that need to be protected with extraordinary measures, right, to ensure that no adversary can, even understand that they exist. So that's kind of the classic black programs. So DOE has their own architecture for special access programs. And then you have the more traditional, much larger zone of classified activities within the Defense Department and the intelligence community. Those are the main big buckets. But even things like DHS, Department of Homeland Security, has their own special access programs. NASA even has their own special access programs. And so within the Defense Department or the intelligence community, which is where the majority of the folks that work on classified materials work, you get access to information associated with your position, whether you've been granted a top secret designation by your agency, and then a need to know to access particular compartments. And so that is basically the architecture. It's pretty sprawling. Probably, at least a few million people have top secret clearances. But any particular program, the fundamental principle is compartmentalization, meaning that you might have the tickets, But if you don't get granted need to know to a particular program or subprogram, you might not know it even exists. And there's, importantly, because you're doing things in secret, we learned pretty hard lessons in the course of the 20th century that if you give security agencies, powers, lots of money, and no oversight, they can kind of go rogue, right? And so you saw this in sort of the Church Committee hearings, a bunch of the activities that were exposed during those investigations, sort of left a black eye on the intelligence community, and they instituted a whole range of reforms. Importantly, giving more teeth to congressional oversight, at least in theory, that certain committees would have legal requirements to be reported to them on any sort of secret activities that the different arms of the government were engaged in. But even that is somewhat siloed. So, for example, if there's a special access program inside the Defense Department, that only gets reported to the senior leadership on the Armed Services Committees. So even the folks that are like the chair of the Senate Select Committee on Intelligence doesn't necessarily have a legal obligation to be reported to him on what the Defense Department is doing. And the Department of Energy has their own oversight committees, but it's not clear that many of those people even know, right, to ask those questions. So in theory, there are reporting channels up to the senior leadership of these defense and intelligence committees. But in practice, right, they're getting kind of very high-level wave-top briefings on this information. It does not usually go into the nitty-gritty details of these programs, which can be quite sprawling, right? Have a big umbrella program and have dozens of different compartments and ways of kind of, obfuscating different activities. So that's kind of the TLDR. It's quite a sprawling, complex world, but it's necessary, right, in many respects to ensure that we have a national security advantage over aggressive adversaries.
So does that mean there could be secret UAP programs siloed from each other in different departments that have no idea that each other exist?
Oh, 100%. I mean, that's not just UAP, but just in general, right?
Okay.
That's the basic explanation, the basic expectation. Even if you are some of those highly clear people in the government, you have no expectation that the person working next to you in the office even understands what you're doing or that you would understand what they're doing.
Right. So a department works for its own self-interest. But would there be a scenario, say, for example, I don't know, national defense or Homeland Security was aware of these crafts, they've retrieved a craft, they've tried to reverse engineer and maybe discover new physics, and they would want to talk to the Department of Energy about the physics they've discovered? And is there a process that they can do that?
Well, we don't know exactly how these alleged legacy programs function across different agencies, what sort of internal structure they have. What we do know from a variety of different witnesses and whistleblower statements in the public, and these are, of course, allegations, none of the definitive evidence has been made public on this subject, is that the Atomic Energy Act essentially has been kind of the umbrella authorizing statute for a number of these programs back in the 50s, essentially, that the mechanisms of secrecy that were established for the Manhattan Project were essentially adapted for and sort of subsumed some of these activities. And so that was maybe kind of the Genesis architecture. I don't know if that has survived to this date, but that would make sense, right? If you're recovering some initial sets of materials, the people you would give it to would be sort of basically the same people that you brought in for the Manhattan Project, right? The smartest physicists, smartest engineers, the folks that are in positions of the highest national trust, our most important, to that date program, our nuclear weapons programs. You would sort of carve out like a special subsection of that architecture for folks to dig into these programs. And that's, I think, where this got started. How that survives to this date, I don't really know. But that would be, different aspects of what you would want to pull together, right? Basic science, engineering, physics, lots of other, sort of domains that you might compartmentalize into different sections.
And how do those departments talk to each other? Because you've kind of spoken before about the sort of Chinese whispers that happen between different programs.
Well, I mean, there's a non-UAP, more prosaic issue of one, overclassification. Oftentimes people in the government like to protect their own territory, protect their own fiefdom. And if, often that means establishing a special access program that's within their control. And then they can sort of gatekeep who from other agencies is sort of briefed in or read into it, right? So it gives them power, it gives them status. And in the government, that's like a very, important totem of sort of leverage over each other, especially when you come down to like, budget negotiations, et cetera. So having your own program that you control access to can create operational issues, right? That where oftentimes you get situations where maybe two different government agencies are both developing essentially very similar sensors in secret, spending essentially duplicated money, right? And I think this is now become an important thrust of kind of reform at the highest levels inside the defense and intelligence community, because they recognize that kind of this architecture of secrecy, especially in domains like space, there's people chasing similar sorts of capabilities in different parts of the government. And because nobody at any given point up the chain kind of knows about both programs, they both get separately authorized. Different contractors go forward and develop these exquisite, expensive capabilities. So just inefficiency, right? We shouldn't actually be spending the same, double the money to basically build the same capability. Whatever the CIA is building, the Air Force should also have access to. And so I think there's been cases where that sort of redundancy has occurred because not as much collaboration or coordination across different government agencies. And there's also a case of just overclassification where, say, like a capability is made so secret that maybe only a 4-star general knows about it, right? But the 4-star doesn't actually do much, right? He's just a guy at the top level. He delegates sort of operational activities to his J2, right? His intelligence guy, and that person may not have the access to that platform. So he can't do his job. So I think there's recognition of the government now that it's kind of gotten a little bit sort of out of hand, just how much these programs have sort of proliferated, but also kind of the silos of secrecy that have developed are sort of limiting our operational effectiveness. And so I think there's some top-down reforms in motion to sort of try to break that. So you would have to sort of set that as like the basic operational kind of bureaucratic context for any sort of UAP thing, right? Like the government is sprawling, bureaucratic, kind of complex Byzantine mess. And there's lots of different parts and pieces, and not necessarily everyone knows what's going on.
And is that inefficiency particular to the US? Like, would China have similar inefficiency, or would they be able to operate in a more efficient way because they don't have those different silos?
I think China has different efficiencies. I mean, every large bureaucracy has these sort of basic principal agent problems, people essentially exploiting their positions, manipulating their leadership, backstabbing each other for budgets and prestige. That's like basic political economy of any large bureaucracy. China has a particular problem with corruption historically inside their military. The PLA, the People's Liberation Army, has been kind of functions as its own kind of industrial conglomerate in addition to being a fighting force. And they have their own businesses, and for many years, the sort of promotion mechanism was basically bribing your superiors. And so that, as you can imagine, leads to less sort of meritocratic progression up the ranks, and folks essentially just paying bribes. And obviously, that leads to sort of organizational dysfunction at a certain level. Xi Jinping has tried to purge some of that out. Instill his own disciplinary cadres in different units to try to keep an eye on people. But there's a sort of an architecture inside the Chinese government that's much more top down. They have their own equivalent of sort of Lockheed, right, that does strategic R&D for them. But it's there's no like arm's length separation that we have between, say, the defense industrial base and the government within the Chinese system. Everyone effectively understands that the government calls the shots. So the power dynamic is a bit more in favor of the state system.
Mm. How does governance and strategy work within secret departments? Who has oversight over these departments?
So in our system, we have an executive branch and we have a legislative branch. Everyone in the executive branch respects, at least in theory, chain of command, right? That if someone is more senior, orders you, especially in a military chain of command, you have to do what they say. Within architectures of secrecy, though, just because someone outranks you doesn't mean they can just order you to tell them information, right? So that's an important restriction on the basic principle of like my boss tells me something and I have to tell them what they ask for. Because access and need to know is governed by the program managers for those programs, especially special access programs, right? That's really what we're talking about here, and those are tightly sealed compartments, right? And so getting access to those essentially requires a determination, sometimes by a committee of folks that are responsible for managing what's called like the bigot list, right? Literally the names of people that are cleared to be read into this program. That's like maintained over potentially decades if they're long running programs. And it's like you get your name added to that list, like that's indelible. But getting your name added to the list isn't just a function of asking for it. You actually have to have the need to know, and the existing managers of the program have to validate that access. Within the legislative branch, obviously we have committees of jurisdiction armed services committees, intelligence committees, oversight committees that are responsible for making sure that the programs that they're authorizing and that they're funding are doing what they want them to do. And that's, of course, like, they're limited in terms of their budgets, their staff, right, to actually dig into these, billion-dollar programs with thousands of different people and many different contractors and try to get a sense in real time of what's actually happening. They ask for briefings, they ask for government accountability, audits. So there's different levers that they can use to sort of try to get questions answered and to investigate allegations of impropriety. The UAP story kind of came out of that version of that sort of oversight mechanism where individuals that were tasked by Congress in the sort of the early stages of their interest in this, they stood up this task force, sort of interagency task force called the Unidentified Anomalous Phenomenon Task Force that was under the auspices of the naval sort of intelligence, and they went around essentially asking their colleagues, right, like, Congress is interested in these subjects. Do you have any UAP related information or programs? And so David Grush was a member of that task force. Carl Nell was a member of that task force. It was led by a guy named Jay Stratton, and they did their job. They did their investigation. Congress was like, hey, we've had people telling us that apparently there are some UAP related programs that we have not been briefed into. We want you to look into this. And that's where David Grush went around and found a number of people that were working on these programs and gave him information, gave him materials, gave him very detailed program information. And so he, in the course of that, realized that there was impropriety, right? That there were programs doing things that were not authorized by their original charter, at least to his investigation. So he reported that through the official channels, kind of whistleblower channels, first in the Defense Department, the Office of the Inspector General, and then he was retaliated against as a result of providing that testimony, and then.
How was he retaliated against?
So he had a number of his accesses were basically cut off. Basically, his clearance to do his job was removed.
But there's no whistleblower protection against that.
At the time, there were pretty general whistleblower protections, but within the intelligence community, it's been kind of known that's kind of sort of weak tea in terms of its protections, especially against things like that can be done in more like administrative guises, right? Like, suspending someone's clearance, is kind of a standard, tactic. It's hard to challenge, right? It's usually, it doesn't like they actually fired you. They just sort of made it harder for you to do your job. A certain compartment can just decide, we want to, cut off access to these people from the, another agency. So yeah, there's kind of a gray zone where you can sort of wield administrative tactics to sort of punish people that are asking the wrong questions.
That was like the professional backlash, but there was also personal backlash, wasn't it?
Yeah, so he faced a number of personal incidents. In his, I haven't been commissioned to describe exactly what happened to him, but it was very, very personal what happened to him. At his home, and so I think
is that public?
I think he's spoken about it.
Okay. I mean, he's described, certain things happened at his house that were intended to intimidate him. So he filed a separate complaint to the Intelligence Community Inspector General, and that's what triggered congressional notification. So the Inspector General of the Intelligence Community did a preliminary investigation per their basic SOP, about a 2-week review where they talked to other individuals that he referred to, and other individuals then subsequently that they interviewed, validated sort of to a first order that his complaint had merit. It was urgent and credible. And so when they make that designation, there's an automatic legal requirement for them to notify the Director of National Intelligence and the Senate Select Committee on Intelligence and the House Permanent Select Committee on Intelligence. And so that I think was a sort of a key inflection point in terms of congressional, like WTF. And then they went in and sort of dug deeper and talked to dozens of other people about these programs over the years. And that has what has then motivated them to go forward with these very striking sort of legislative requirements that are now coming up for debate again this year on the UAP Disclosure Act.
And these people who've retaliated, is it essentially because they don't believe there's a benefit to this information being out as public as it is? They don't want Congress having access to it? Why would they retaliate? What's the battle that's happening?
I mean, in general, not just UAPs aside, right? There's kind of a, when you work in the classified world, especially on Black programs, there's like a basic omerta, that you take, right? You just don't talk out of school, right? If you actually work for the CIA, you sign a special non-disclosure agreement, which means if you get asked to testify to Congress or ask questions by Congress, you sign an agreement that says you will notify the CIA before you talk to Congress, right? They're not saying you're not going to be allowed to talk to Congress. They're just saying you agreed to let us know if Congress asks you questions, right? So this is just kind of the basic built into the DNA of these systems that are designed to protect secrets. That's basically their function, right?
So do these departments in some ways start acting apolitical?
I don't know if it's political, like capital P political. It's political in the sense that they're trying to protect it's sometimes mixed motives, but sometimes they're good faith motives that there are very sensitive programs that are extremely fragile in the sense that if U.S. adversaries were to understand their even existence, their function for U.S. national security could be compromised fatally, right? And so these are very perishable capabilities that a certain sensor in a certain place, if they know that exists, it just gets destroyed. It gets taken out, and no longer can the U.S. government understand what's happening in that particular.
So I don't mean political.
Yeah.
I mean apolitical. Like they separate themselves from party politics. They said their agenda is almost independent of any any political party, any political party agenda. They understand they understand what they're doing is for the benefit of their kind of patriots in some way.
I mean. Yeah, so like the staff that we're talking about here within, let's say, the defense or intelligence or Department of Energy, they're career civil servants. So within the U.S. government kind of political apparatus or government apparatus, there are political appointees, sort of a layer that gets brought in usually with each administration for senior executive service positions, and those are usually awarded to qualified but like politically aligned individuals, folks that come in with folks that come in or that are aligned with a certain administration or certain sort of leadership faction. But then there's this civil service bureaucracy, people who spend their entire careers working inside the Defense Department, 20, 30-year lifers, and they work their way up to different positions of management responsibility. And those individuals have a sense that essentially ultimately the long-term interests of the government of the nation require more than just kind of the transient attentions of a political class that comes in every 2 to 3 years and rotates out for a different job. And so they see it as like their mission to kind of safeguard the nation's crown jewels, right? And that ultimately these are their programs to control and to protect. And I think that is done out of good faith, right? And across all these different programs that you want to understand, you want to make sure that we're thinking strategically and not just whatever the current political leadership wants us to do. And that's been a classic feature of American sort of security institutions for decades. Is sort of this tension between wanting to ensure that you're being responsive to the White House or to the political leadership. Like they have their own priorities. Ultimately, they set policy. But long-term strategic capability development, say, or research and development, or the management of very, very sensitive collection programs, those are like very tightly protected, right? Because they don't want those to just be compromised because a president wants to have a good headline or wants to distract something, right? But that's often the sort of the tug and sort of the tug and pull inside the defense and intelligence systems.
But that means there's a lot of good people who are very good at keeping secrets.
Oh, I mean, that's their job, right? We've spent, 80 years building these bureaucratic systems to protect, very, very fragile information, and they've done it very well.
What happens when somebody does break their clearance, does leak something? Mm-hmm. How regular an occurrence is, and how do they deal with that?
I mean, the game of spy versus spy is extremely intense, right? So, any given year, you'll see cases brought by the Department of Justice on rolling up individuals inside the intelligence community that are essentially working on behalf of a foreign power, right? So China is very aggressive, in particular, at recruiting Americans for a variety of reasons to spill basically the beans. Sell national defense information. So that does happen. The penalties are quite severe, especially if you engage in espionage. It can be the death penalty, right? We have the 1917 Espionage Act, which warrants, capital punishment. It's rarely, I think, applied. I think the last time someone was executed for espionage was the Rosenbergs back in after they basically compromised the parts of the Manhattan Project. But there's individuals, that were sentenced to life in prison. Richard Ames, a number of, classic sort of Cold War traitors, So the penalties are quite severe. If you just leak information, I mean, that's kind of the classic DC game of like, on background, senior administration official describes in general some capability, or they talk to Bob Woodward. And, I think those sorts of things happen and they're not punished because essentially they're like authorized leaks. They're done for strategic purposes, or for whatever reason, the Department of Justice just doesn't look at it. But in general, though, those are like, in most cases, not very super sensitive, right, capabilities, or they're, they're discussions on, say, how we're going to handle, negotiations with Israel over, sort of hostage issues, right? These are classified discussions, but they're not like, okay, we have some super secret capability somewhere and it's going to blow it up. It's done for political purposes or geopolitical signaling. But yeah, the penalties for betraying, these extremely well protected compartments can be, they will say like the Espionage Act gives us the right for capital punishment. And in the military, in particular, if you remember the military, with some of this access, you're subject to a different administrative regime, right? You have, the military system of law that you have to respond to. You can be, arrested and charged inside the military justice system and thrown into the brig. Your case will be seen by military tribunal, and none of that would be public. There's no like docket that would show up on a public letter. And so, yeah, if you're especially in the military, the punishments can be quite severe, especially in the military system.
Can you talk about why you know all this?
Oh, so my background, like, I guess, yeah, we kind of just jumped right into this whole thing. I can sort of rewind the clock and kind of give a brief bio, right? So I studied physics and philosophy as an undergrad at Hopkins.
Even more than that, like, were you into this as a kid?
Not particularly, no. I mean, I was a huge science and physics nerd. As a kid, I, read lots of, nerdy books. The one that I say that touched on this subject tangentially was a book called The Hunt for Zero Point by an aerospace defense journalist named Nick Cook, who, he tracked, U.S. military sort of aviation programs. He had lots of sources inside, say, Lockheed. And he wrote this really interesting book. I read it, I think, early in high school, about trying to get to the bottom of like what were sort of the most secret U.S. government programs, right? In terms of our, stealth fighter jets and bombers, et cetera. And, he was trying to pick up on a number of like breadcrumbs that, pointed him in the direction of sort of like fundamental physics, because I was a physics nerd. And so the hunt for zero point was the hunt for zero point energy. That was sort of the canard of that there was some, mysterious understanding of physics that potentially could be used to generate novel propulsion systems and, really radical sort of aerospace platforms. And so that was like the, only sort of UFO book I ever read. It wasn't really about UFOs. It was actually just, essentially a reporting about potential secret government aerospace programs. But most of what I read was just science, physics, nerd stuff. Yeah.
And then from there, then?
Yeah, so I went to Hopkins. I was going to do a PhD in physics, so I studied physics, and then I was interested in philosophy, so I did a second major there. I had sort of a crisis where I was like, I actually don't like the work of being an academic, even if I like the subject matter. And so then I sort of pivoted hard to doing something else. I went to London School of Economics, where I did a master's in philosophy and public policy to kind of bridge maybe into science policy. And so I came back to DC and I got a job working for the National Science Foundation as a sort of a 2-year sort of fellowship, helping support, the grants that the government gives out for basic research. But there I was actually supporting all of the economics sort of discipline research, game theory, decision risk and management sciences, like business school research. And it's usually a feeder program to other PhD programs. But again, I decided I didn't want to do a PhD. I sort of randomly stumbled into a college buddy of mine at a trivia night that we were working together, and my fellowship was coming to an end. He said, well, if you actually want to come, just work for the startup, we have some interesting contracts. We're a small, company, but we're going to be growing fast. And we do essentially war games for the government. Exercises is what they call it, is sort of the parlance. And I was like, yeah, that sounds cool. Get a clearance, work in DC, live in Clarendon, just kind of have a good, early 20s lifestyle. And so, yeah, that's kind of got my start working in sort of this area. And for about the next 10 years...
Can you talk about those war games? Like, how does that work? What's the structure of even... Is it thesis?
Yeah, so there's a program. It's actually managed by FEMA, but it's really for
Okay.
the National Security Council, because FEMA is sort of a
It's
department.
emergencies.
Yeah, so the Federal Emergency Management Agency, which is actually part in the U.S. of the Department of Homeland Security. FEMA, actually, its historical genesis was actually Cold War contingency planning, right? So it was stood up essentially by Nixon or Kennedy. Was sort of the civil defense, and then Nixon kind of formalized it into FEMA. But its original mission was sort of preparing for nuclear war, and then it sort of evolved over the course of the 20th century to take on increasingly more like traditional disaster response, like helping people with floods and hurricanes and tornadoes, and giving checks basically to people to rebuild their houses. But there are kind of two parts of FEMA. There's like the disaster preparedness part of FEMA, ensuring the government can help and make sure that peoples are resilient and can recover from natural disasters. And there's a part of FEMA that's responsible for ensuring the continuity of the government under all bad scenarios, including full-scale nuclear war. And so that's like built into the different parts of FEMA. But this national exercise program is sort of the national program, to help ensure the government is prepared across many different scenarios for many different departments. So whether it's pandemics, cyber attacks, highly destructive earthquakes, tornadoes, hurricanes, as well as terrorist attacks, improvised nuclear devices, nuclear war. So everything.
Alien invasion?
There was never a scenario that I participated in that was about alien invasions.
But how do you model these?
Yeah, so the basic doctrine is in the government there's different types of exercises. You could have a very small scale discussion-based exercise where say 10, 20 people, could be mid-level people in the government or the cabinet, right, the national security officials themselves, that just get around the table and have a facilitated structured discussion, right? So essentially it's just, hey, North Korea might be launching a nuke. This is the scenario. We're going to walk through the different courses of action, the different sort of decision milestones and considerations that leadership will have to go through. And that's kind of like a pretty high level strategic discussion. But then on the other end of the spectrum are like operations-based exercises. And those are can be very resource and logistically intensive. You can have hundreds, maybe thousands of people actually in different positions in the field or in, say, command centers, and they're rehearsing their roles and responsibilities in a particular crisis scenario. And that requires, months, potentially, a year plus planning to ensure that all the different arms and legs of all the different governments, are good with the scenario, and then you are structuring the whole event basically to try to capture data on exactly, what decisions, who did what, was that actually according to the plan that they had, written down for that scenario? And the whole purpose of this is to kind of build muscle memory, identify, gaps in capabilities or gaps in decision making. So a lot of what I did was both on the planning of those exercises and then the evaluation, right? So actually, making sure that everyone agrees across all these different departments on what we're going to evaluate, how we're going to do it, who's going to play, what the scenario is going to be. And everyone has a different thing, right? So for example, there's a big exercise I did back in 2016, which was, bad guys have a bad thing they want to have happen in the United States. And we have to use kind of the intelligence community to, track the bad guys as they try to get into the United States with the bad thing. And then, send special teams to try to, stop them. And then if we fail and the bad thing happens, how are we going to ensure the government can respond and recover, from that bad day, right? And so there's a whole chain of capabilities that span the intelligence community, the Defense Department, say the FBI, Department of Homeland Security, FEMA, the National Security Council, even Health and Human Services, right? If you have a bad thing that kills or injures lots of people, you need to have special medical supplies, you need a surge capabilities to, for like a mass casualty event. So there's a whole series of things the government has built.
It's all defense and response. There's nothing offensive in there.
Well, I mean, many of these scenarios are about preparedness and resilience and response. Obviously, the whole purpose of the intelligence community is to ensure the bad days don't happen, right? The Defense Department. Yeah. So it's like, yes, like plan A is, the terrorists don't get over here, or, the bad guys don't launch the missiles at us, right? But you have to prepare for what if that fails? What if deterrence fails? What if, our counterterrorism operations fail at disrupting plots? You have to prepare for the bad scenario if they do succeed, and have a plan to respond and ensure that, you can bring back economic functioning and save lives under all hazard scenarios. That's kind of what I did for about those 10 years.
Could there be a scenario in that leads to something like the Iraq War?
What do you mean?
Well, so if one of these preparations, one of these plans was a scenario where you're considering maybe Saddam Hussein has weapons of mass destruction, and the fear is that he would use them, and this would be the outcome. We can't allow that to happen. We have to be offensive here. We have to go to war. Can those scenarios come out of these departments?
So we never, at least in National Exercise Program, really looked at sort of those geopolitical scenarios, right? Those are usually...
So it's domestic.
It's really focused on national defense, homeland defense.
Okay.
Right. To ensure that, bad things happening here or to, our territories, right? Say Guam. That was kind of the scope, right? There's a whole separate branch of the government that does, war gaming for, different operational conflicts or different operational scenarios for different conflicts, right? So they're constantly gaming out, okay, what would happen? How would we deter China from invading Taiwan? What would happen if there's an invasion of Taiwan of different kinds, or a blockade, or a quarantine? So they're constantly in the Defense Department developing different operational plans for a whole different range of scenarios, and they're constantly rehearsing and training and developing capabilities to mitigate gaps they identify in those war games. But those are very different. So there's kind of the homeland defense, national preparedness scenarios that I was responsible for, and then within the Defense Department, they do their war planning for very specific contingencies.
Yeah, it starts to become easy to see why the U.S. government is so big.
I mean, yeah, it is probably one of the largest bureaucracies on the planet. Yeah,
it is the largest bureaucracy on the planet.
I mean, maybe China has a run for that. Maybe there's parts of the Indian government that are larger, but yeah.
Okay, so where did you go from there?
So I worked for a number of different programs, both doing these exercise evaluations, which are discrete events, but then I would also do like assessments of different government programs. So whether it's sort of the design of the programs or the technology that they're using, the different capabilities they have. So I would evaluate those different programs. I also led a program for operational experimentation for the government, where it was trying to understand what do different parts of the government need in terms of capabilities, going out to, say, private industry and sort of surveying them. Okay, what do you guys have that might align to these requirements? And then designing different events to say, take some of those capabilities that met at least a smell test out to the field in different, whether it's a military base or out into the ocean, to actually design real world experiments to try to test and evaluate these different capabilities. So I did a lot of that for about 10 years. I also did like force structure assessments, like how big does FEMA need to be? I helped lead and design that, and then similar force structure assessment for CISA, which is a new agency that got stood up, the Cybersecurity and Infrastructure Security Agency, also part of DHS, and they had an increasingly broad mandate to ensure not just protection of our basic critical infrastructure from physical destruction, but from the increasing real threat from cyber attacks. And so I got much more deeply into sort of cybersecurity more generally. And then I left sort of that phase of doing government consulting. I joined a firm called the Krebs Stamos Group that was all focused on sort of private sector work. And there the intersection was sort of geopolitical risk and cybersecurity with business strategy. So our clients for the Krebs Stamos Group were mostly large multinational, some critical technology companies that were now facing a much more disruptive and uncertain sort of global business environment. So a lot of our clients were sort of the C-suite or the boards of these firms that want to understand what is their security posture, how do they navigate a much more uncertain environment. And I was the director of intelligence for the Krebs Stamos Group, a small sort of boutique consultancy. Did that for a few years, and then a publicly traded cybersecurity company called SentinelOne acquired Krebs Stamos Group, and we became Pinnacle One, the strategic advisory group. So SentinelOne is a cybersecurity company. They have a whole platform of software to help protect corporate networks and government networks from cyber attack. Basically, it's kind of the basic idea. We are essentially still doing the strategic consulting arm of that business. And again, these are my personal opinions, not those of my employer. And so, yeah, in that work, a lot of what I do is understand, both geopolitical risk, sort of what are the different plans and intentions, and risk scenarios facing different multinationals, say in or from China, or in Eastern Europe, or in the Middle East. pick your flashpoint. Look at the specific sort of cyber threats that they face. What sorts of threat actors looking to target their networks, whether it's nation states or cyber criminals, hacktivists or insiders, and sort of help them understand how they how their current basic security controls, their security programs, as well as their business strategy. Say joint ventures in China or their R&D systems, or who they have working on their sensitive programs, whether those are sufficient.
Who was it who was showing us their company that had the relentless attacks?
Oh, it was Chester.
Chester, yeah.
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 He works as IT security. I'm not sure the company. Yeah.
Was it something ridiculous like there's like a million
It was
a
like
day?
millions a day. Yeah.
Yeah.
I think a lot of those were driven by AI now.
Yeah, I mean, people, this famous in cyber worlds, like the pew pew maps that just show all the quote unquote attacks, which are usually just kind of automated pings of people's infrastructure, but they're not, in my parlance, like considered quote attacks, right? Usually, what in my world, when we think about an attack on a particular company, like the sort of two canonical main threats is either ransomware or nation states, right? So ransomware, they obviously just want to get into your network. Most of it is actually just exploiting some individual that has administrative sort of privileges, and you can social engineer them, get the access to the network, or you just get someone to sort of click a link that they shouldn't, and you can install malware and ideally spread into the network, encrypt files, and basically make people pay money to get those files unlocked. That's like the basic business model of ransomware now. It's quite lucrative, and that's just to make money. There's also very capable groups in most advanced countries now that just focus on cyber attacks for espionage purposes, right? So there's lots of valuable information sitting in different corporate and government networks, and you want to understand what that information is, whether it's a design for an F-35 component or an internal deliberation on some policy question. National intelligence services have a mandate to go and spy and steal that information, and that's considered sort of spy versus spy.
Does everyone do it?
Oh, everyone does this. Even in private, corporate espionage, this is a basic expectation that there's all sorts of people selling capabilities to spy on anybody. Right? You can get a zero-click piece of malware for a decent chunk, but you can buy it, right? Basically get it into anyone's phone. So this is just the basic sort of status quo. But increasingly, what national security officials are more worried about are the use of cyber for strategic deterrence or actual disruption of civil infrastructure in crisis scenarios. And so this is where it moves from traditional spy versus spy, economic espionage, stealing information, to cyber destruction, right? Using cyber as a means to, say, interrupt the functioning of the grid, waste and water treatment plants, the functioning of port infrastructure, communication systems, financial, and sort of banking systems. And China, in particular, is probably the most severe threat to U.S. infrastructure in that regard. They have a specific group that has been named. In the West, we call it Volt Typhoon. It's the Eastern Theater Command of the PLA, or part of the Eastern Theater Command, and their objective is to systematically penetrate and establish persistence in a range of U.S. critical infrastructure, private, sort of corporate owned and operated critical infrastructure, ports, wastewater treatment plants, telecommunication systems, et cetera, with the specific objective that if they get ordered to be able to just disrupt those networks.
Is this war preparation?
It is preparing for escalation scenarios that could include war. But importantly, part of their doctrine is to try to deter U.S. decision makers in a crisis from engaging militarily by causing severe disruptions to our military mobilization. One, so we actually can't load the people onto planes that we would need to mobilize to get them into theater. Ports are shut down around military infrastructure, disrupts their operational activities, as well as to affect our society, right? To instill a sense of panic and anxiety and prioritize in the minds of decision makers domestic stability and response to those disruptions over deploying forces into a foreign theater. And that this could be done in an escalating series of sort of calculated disruptions to try to deter us from, say, defending Taiwan in a crisis environment. Once we're actually in a war, once we're actually, throwing down. Cyber becomes maybe less relevant from a strategic perspective. It becomes more relevant kind of tactically, right? Using cyber, say, to disrupt very specific systems, whether space systems, using electronic warfare to disrupt command and control or ISR, and like in theater. And that's the lesson of Ukraine has sort of showed us that cyber really wasn't kind of the end all be all. It's kind of both. You have trench warfare, drone warfare. There have been some very significant cyber attacks early in the war against the Viasat satellite system, which was taken down and very severely disrupted Ukraine's military command and control. In that case, actually, Starlink was quite critical. And there have been cases where cyber attacks have taken down certain sort of infrastructure in Ukraine, power grids, the internet, et cetera. But they haven't really shifted the balance, right, of forces or the strategic kind of sort of battle on the front lines.
And so this is happening in every direction. The US and China are doing it to each other. Russia and the US are probably doing it to each other. Would Russia and Russia and China do it to each other, even though they act as allies?
I mean, everyone spies on each other, even friends. We have legal agreements, within the Five Eyes, which is, US, UK, Canada, New Zealand, Australia, that we don't spy on each other.
But we probably do.
I mean, maybe not. Having a systematic program to spy on the Brits would probably be sort of a no-go. Like, the value of that relationship is so intertwined, and like our technical capabilities are so integrated that there's probably obviously at the political layer, there's all sorts of what you might call political intelligence, but like actual signals intelligence collection on each other. Like, we basically use the same systems, right?
We're sick of you, man. We're pussies.
Yeah, I mean, but like the basic function of the intelligence partnership is that this is kind of the deal, right? But yeah, within Russia and China, they certainly have nothing like that agreement. Of course, they spy on each other. Would they attack each other? I mean, that's a political decision based off of their geopolitical relationship, right? Right now, they have determined at the leadership level that there's a geopolitical alignment of interest between the two of them. They're going to actually share capabilities. They're going to support each other in their different endeavors. They have a no limit strategic partnership. There are of course limits, but that's kind of the rhetoric. But no, I mean, they have the capabilities, but they're not deployed against each other at the moment. All the Chinese hackers are focused on other people.
Right. Okay. Where does the UAPs come into this? Where does this all start?
I mean, I guess it's not on the cyber side. It's not directly relevant. I guess on the counterintelligence side.
For you.
Oh yeah. So I just had an interest in. I was sort of paying attention to the news in 2017. I saw the New York Times article. I thought that was curious. That's interesting. The government is, apparently serious about this. So I just kept monitoring it over the years, and I tracked the sort of progressions of the bills, especially as they were introduced, because I paid close attention in general to the National Defense Authorization Act, just as part of my job, right? Like the Senate in particular usually takes the first crack at that. And they put out what they want, essentially, the Defense Department and the intelligence community through the Intelligence Authorization Act to do. And oftentimes they're going to write in, like new provisions that are political priorities for them. And in my job, that's important to know, right? If they're going to be like a new cybersecurity provision, a new requirement, those are things that I have to track. And so starting in FY21, I think was the first year that they put some reporting requirements on UAPs into law. And that generated the first preliminary assessment report, I think in June of 2021. That was like got a lot of news at the time. That was, the government is collecting reports. This is how many reports they have. They've seen this many. This is the procedure they're standing up. They started to be the initial movements of kind of bureaucratic kind of formalization of these activities. And then every year from FY21, FY22, FY23, you saw an increasing ratchet of more specific and broadly scoped legislative requirements being imposed on the Defense Department from Congress. And they only seem to be getting more and more intense and more broadly scoped. And so I was paying attention to that, as it was happening, and kind of, asking myself the question, why? Why is the Senate in particular, not letting this go, right? Year after year, in fact, getting their questions being more and more intense and more serious as time has gone by. And, the specific legislative language was highly suggestive, right? Where they're actually, restricting by law any funding to any sort of unreported UAP-related program. And usually when you see that, you're like, well, they wouldn't. Like, why are they putting that in law? So someone must have told them that there's some money going to these UAP programs that has not been reported to them. And the first thing, of course, a politician, especially someone who oversight, gets mad about is when, they're not told something that they think they need to know as part of their job, that they have the power or the authority to know certain things or to make decisions about certain, funds. And if that decision has been sort of, yanked from their responsibility, without their consent, they get really mad about it. And so that's, I think, what's been motivated a lot of folks inside the Senate is like, WTF, like this is our democratic, mandate. This is my personal, power that has been essentially, abrogated from me without my permission. And, I'm going to get to the bottom of it. And so this is now culminated in, much more explicit now, very eye-opening language that has come out of Senator Schumer, Senator Rounds, Gillibrand, Martin Heinrich, Todd Young, very serious people, bipartisan basis that are basically saying, in certain terms that they think credible evidence and testimony indicates that unreported UAP programs exist that have been illegally, held from the American public and congressional oversight, including elected officials in the executive branch, there's only two, president and vice president, and that they need to be a formal process to investigate, to subpoena witnesses, to take testimony, to create a central repository of all the UAP-related records in the U.S. government, as well as any UAP-related information from private companies, and to take possession of any technologies of unknown origin and biological materials. And so this is...
Just take possession mean?
Like if, say, a private aerospace company has craft materials, ejecta, debris, fully intact craft that are in their possession, sitting in a physical space that they own and occupy, that federal government reserves the right to take possession of those materials.
Okay. So it's quite interesting the way this can play out publicly within the United States, whereas a similar program within China just doesn't have to do the same. Mm-hmm. And is there strategic advantages and disadvantages to this?
Yeah, so I think this is, if you listen to the remarks of some U.S. senators, Senator Rounds in particular, where he's responded to questions on the subject, this tension between transparency, accountability, disclosure is the term of art, and protecting national security has been the dominant tension, right? The main concern expressed by individuals like Senator Rounds has been they want accountability and transparency, but they don't want to compromise national security. They don't want to compromise sources and methods or sensitive U.S. government capabilities. And in a democratic process, this is the tension you are constantly having to navigate, where in a democracy, it's the people's money, the people's government making decisions on matters of very sensitive, secret information. And there's been kind of a long-standing tension in democracies between secret intelligence activities and democracy, right? It's like trying to find that balance, right? China has no tension to resolve. It's just built into the system that almost anything can be considered a national secret. They've even classified like basic economic data at this point. So if you're just a firm that's doing like due diligence on a potential acquisition, and you're going in and asking questions of different suppliers or different technology companies inside China, or you're trying to get information on sort of microscale economic sort of indicators, and what looks from the Chinese government perspective, that could be considered espionage, and individuals that do that could be considered could be arrested. And so the Chinese government is very much about locking down information across their whole society, not just things that are explicitly military. And so for them, there's no tension between preserving democratic norms and legitimacy and oversight and accountability and secrecy. It's all a top-down, centrally controlled process. And so, yeah, that's not a tension they have to deal with. And so that means that if the U.S. government had these legacy programs, which historically, would have to be relatively small, right? If you had these extremely sensitive programs doing something quite exotic, quite world-shaking, you wouldn't want to have too many people involved, right? You'd keep the circle as small as possible. China, I think, could probably have a larger number of people working on similar programs and still be able to keep it a secret. I think just the basic mechanisms inside China would probably enable them to have a much larger footprint. And what's interesting from me, from my perspective, like why is this happening now? Looking at some of the text that has come out of the Senate in particular about their motivations for crafting this legislation, is that and they put this in writing, basically said in order to mitigate the possibility of foreign technology surprise, the U.S. government must expand awareness of historical exotic technology antecedents previously provided by the federal government for research and development purposes. So that was a line that was in language, and that I think spells it out, right? It's like, in order to mitigate the possibility of foreign technology surprise, meaning China might get the jump on us, might all of a sudden come out with something that has, like a breakthrough leap ahead capability. In order to mitigate that possibility, the federal government must broaden awareness of historical exotic technology antecedents. Now, that's a mouthful.
Yeah.
They're basically referring to, historical exotic technology that has been previously acquired by federal government and has been provided by the federal government for research and development purposes. They left out kind of the propositional clause there of like provided by the federal government for research and development purposes to who, right? It's provided by the federal government. Well, who do they provide it to? I think the clear implication is they provided these historical exotic technology antecedents to elements of the defense industrial base to try to figure out how they work. And so the natural inference I draw from that is that, okay, Lockheed, Boeing, Raytheon, these guys got this stuff decades ago. They had a tiny number of people working on these programs to try to figure out how this exotic technology functions. And maybe they not have made much progress. And meanwhile, might be separate channels of intelligence reporting coming out of our very effective capabilities to track the state of Chinese military R&D. That's a main priority, is understanding like what can China's systems do. How capable are their hypersonic missiles? What sorts of stealth do their subs have? What sorts of detection capabilities do they have? We want to know all of that stuff. So we're going to recruit people inside those agencies to tell us what they're doing. We're going to try to track all their scientists. We're going to try to do everything we can to understand what the Chinese military R&D is looking at. So you can imagine a scenario where our intelligence collection apparatus looking at China tracks a bunch of scientists, engineers, different programs being stood up that would be like, well, that's odd. A bunch of people that are working on this rocket program just got moved over to this part. And there seems to be a lot of money, a lot of resources being sucked into this new thing. What are they doing over there? That seems to be important. And if a different part of the intelligence community now was like, there seems to be something quite exotic, something new that the Chinese are really crashing their effort on, that reporting would sort of float up to, say, the Senate. Right? And they would get reporting on maybe China's actually looking at these programs in a different way than we have. And so now we need to basically change the security architecture for these historical legacy programs. That in order to mitigate the possibility of, say, China getting the jump on us, we need to bring in new people. We need to bring in more people. And the only way we can do that is if we kind of broaden awareness of these programs, which means we have to prepare, maybe a larger set of people for the existence of these materials. And then we have to then assume that we might have to answer this larger question to civil society on, well, what exactly has been going on these last 80 years, right? And so this is kind of, these are all interlinked things, right? In order to mitigate this geopolitical risk, this technological surprise risk, we have to have a serious national plan for disclosure, for being increasingly transparent and having a more open, serious conversation about UAPs. Like these are entangled strategic requirements.
Yeah, it's kind of nuts.
I mean, it is what it is. Yeah.
It's gone from speculative to reality.
Yeah, I think we're in this moment of transition. Most people haven't been paying close attention, so it sounds kind of kooky. But if you've been paying close attention, you read the language and you listen to the statements made by some of our most senior national security officials and congressional, national leadership, they're as serious as a heart attack. I mean, this is like no joke.
But the wider public, outside of niche podcasts and people have a niche interest, haven't fully grokked the idea that these things exist, or probably still think it's speculative.
Yeah, I think you're right. I mean, it's going to be a process of slow diffusion. The way I sort of think about it occurring is sort of two main mechanisms. Maybe intentional, may just be a side effect, is in networks, like human society is a set of networks, and you can have information spread through what you might call like a process of percolation, or sort of high trust personal relationships. There's small clusters of people that are paying close attention to this, both in and out of government, in different positions of professional responsibility, and they develop high trust personal bonds, and they're psychologically disposed to thinking about this in a serious way. And so information, maybe more information, flows through those sort of personal high trust networks. and that spreads then awareness among certain professional circles to take it more seriously. And then there's a much more, I say, a slower process of diffusion into society more broadly, where people just pay attention to what's on their Twitter feed. Occasionally, someone like Lula Lazanda will go on CNN or do like a 2-minute interview, and people will go, there's a guy in the Pentagon UFO program, there's a book, New York Times bestseller, talking about talking about UFOs. That's interesting. But it doesn't, it's like a slow progression of sort of establishing, maybe softening the cognitive territory, but necessarily isn't about transmitting detailed information to prepare, people professionally, which is, I think what's been happening in a separate channel.
Well, I think some people really need to see themselves for themselves, high quality, up close videos, perhaps. A little bit like MTV Cribs, but with alien ships, where somebody's walking them around and actually showing the technology that exists, or maybe photography of little green men. They kind of need the full package to believe it.
Yeah, I mean,
which you don't think we'll get.
I think. Well, there's lots of footage. There's lots of information that could be released. I think there's some information that could be released that would be increasingly suggestive, increasingly raise questions in people's minds, but I wouldn't necessarily say it would be like dispositive, right? I think to sufficiently trigger maybe a majority shift in a belief on this subject, you'd have to literally trot out the stuff. You'd have to open kimono. This is the craft. This is what we think how they work. These are the materials we've recovered. This is what we think how they operate. Or this is what we've tried to figure out. We'd have to really truly open the door to these programs. But I think that's not going to happen, because to do that would also give away to our adversaries what we do or do not know about those programs. And I also think there's an acute recognition that you don't want mass belief to shift so radically. You want there to be a slow progression of gradual and incremental adjustment of belief on this subject, so that if you do get to the point where there's maybe a much more disruptive event or recognition of something exotic, that everyone doesn't just flip their beliefs overnight, and that people can react in
because that could be too disruptive.
Yeah, people could have a psychological reaction that wouldn't be desirable on a societal level. That would be something you'd want to prepare for, right? This is why in the legislation that's being proposed, that's up for consideration again, probably in the next few months, as long as it gets built into a manager's package, just like it was last year, is for a controlled disclosure campaign plan. And it would establish a independent review board, a UAP records review board, modeled after the JFK records review assassination board. But the membership that's specified in law is sort of a recognition of these different considerations, not just a national security official, a foreign affairs official, but someone is a historian, a sociologist, an economist, people representing civil society. That the bill envisages a formal plan developed by this review board that would have collection authorities over any UAP record in the government to take possession and make disposition decisions over any technology of unknown origin or biological materials, and make a recommendation to the president on a disclosure campaign plan. This is the way we recommend to the president which information we should disclose, declassify, in what order, right? And have all these different individuals of national sort of stature that represent these different disciplines, sort of elements of national power and strategic interest, come together and say, this is the sort of sequence of information that we want to disclose, to ensure, that we have a full, transparent process while ensuring, strategic stability. And that's what the law calls for, right? That's the process. If you don't have that process, the formal mechanisms, you could have what, one of the, lead drafters of the bill called catastrophic disclosure. You could have just information come out that was not in a controlled plan process, but is just, here it is. Now deal with it. That obviously would maybe not be as desirable as, people have different views. People say, yeah, just throw it all out there and let people react.
Well, it's the philosophical questions that become important then, is what exists and what does it mean? Mm-hmm. Is this technology that China has and the US has and this changes warfare, or is this the existence of non-human technology controlled by non-human beings of some kind, and is that a threat? Like the big philosophical questions come into play for what this actually means. Because if it's just recovery of a craft and recovery of technology and it's warfare, that's a very different scenario from, oh yeah, like aliens are amongst us. Which, by the way, I can't even believe I'm fucking saying. But it's...
Yeah, I think for me, I come at this from my background as both physics and philosophy, and then public policy, and then doing national security work for a number of years. So like I try to synthesize all those different perspectives. There's the core national security perspective, which I think is what has been dominant in kind of the discussion. Obviously, it also, I think, is what is a good hook for congressional interest and for bureaucratic kind of leverage inside the Pentagon, is that if you're to say, I'm going to study some interesting aspects about the world, I'm just going to do basic science research, some novel thing that could be happening. Okay, that's fine. Go do that. That's National Science Foundation stuff. Okay, that has nothing to do with like national defense. But if there are aircraft or other platforms, maybe under the ocean or in air or in space, that are that have invaded sensitive sort of airspace and defense facilities over our nuclear weapons silos, that are buzzing our fighter jets, that are interfering with carrier group workups, that is a national security issue, right? You have actual defense equities that are manifestly vulnerable to something that's out there, right? And that is a national security concern, right? It could be an adversary that's using UAPs as cover to do intelligence, surveillance, reconnaissance of our military capabilities, or to sort of insert noise into how we think about detecting and protecting our most sensitive platforms. And so that is a natural, I think, initial angle of attack for getting this sort of inside the political discourse in a more official way, right? Because most people aren't ready to initially just jump to these more difficult and amorphous philosophical, more foundational questions, right? It's just there's something flying around doing things that we can't understand in sensitive airspace, interrupting our military capabilities, and potentially even harming military and intelligence service members. And that's a 5-alarm fire, right? That if you can't protect, if your basic military capabilities, you've got a lot of questions to answer. I mean, we've had weeks of disruption a few months ago to Langley Air Force Base. We had similar disruptions over Palmdale, which is Lockheed Martin Skunk Works.
Talk about what actually happened.
Yeah, so there was drones, meaning or UAPs that were detected flying in and around Langley Air Force Base. This is maybe 3 months ago, and they actually had to move the entire fighter squadron out there to a new base because they couldn't actually launch. Basically, all the airspace was shut down. It was a big deal because that Langley Air Force Base is responsible for protecting the National Capital Region as like its air defense. They scramble those jets. And so this was a big deal, right? You had a pretty significant national capability that was severely disrupted for several weeks, and there's been no public explanation of exactly what happened. I mean, people draw hints to maybe it was the Chinese, sending drones to try to test our capabilities, cause nuisance. That's like the natural, first order explanation, but nobody's actually said that, right? There's been no evidence that's been brought to bear on what these things are. I mean, I did a whole series of assessments a number of years ago explicitly on counter unmanned aerial systems in the National Capital Region for our different, systems of protection, both military, Secret Service, et cetera. And I ran through all these scenarios, not about UAPs, but about, small unmanned systems, how they could kind of get in over different perimeters, what would be our detection capabilities, how would we respond. That was like in 2016, 2017. That was a long time ago. This was a question, an issue that we knew about. 2024 comes around 8 years later, and you have these massive disruptions over these very sensitive facilities.
So what do you think happened?
I don't know. There's been no public, evidence on this. I've heard, rumors that people saw things that didn't look like drones, but that's all it is, right? But this is the basic problem. Because we have this taboo, because we basically just either one, assume it's just always some prosaic explanation. Okay, well, that's a huge problem, right? Okay, can China basically shut down, on a whim, different platforms, but just by flying a few, commercial drones over it? Like, that's not great.
But I would have thought just commercial drones would be shot down.
You would think that.
Yeah.
Which over several weeks, apparently, we were unable to use our. You can imagine this was a massive problem for senior leadership in the government, being like, "Wait, why does this keep happening? Why can't we?" We had to move this whole, squadron.
So why couldn't the planes take off from there?
Well, when you have objects coming into your airspace willy-nilly, you can't launch, fighter jets, especially, Langley Air Force Base is in the middle of nowhere. It's, relatively populated area. It interferes with the airspace and you can't launch anymore. You can't conduct your normal missions.
Like I said, I would expect them to be shot down. So these don't sound like drones. You would expect it to be something.
We haven't
physics.
shot. I've seen no reports that we were able to shoot anything down, protect the airspace, stop these objects from coming in and out.
So it sounds like they probably couldn't shoot them down because it's something with different physics, perhaps.
It could be. It could be maybe China has, an autonomous platform that doesn't have any uplink or downlink that you can jam or disrupt. Maybe it's sufficiently maneuverable that a net or another platform can't get a target lock on it. So there's other explanations besides we can't shoot it down. It could just be an advanced platform.
And it might not necessarily be Chinese.
Yeah, it could be China's, Russia. Most people look at China because, one, they have probably the more advanced capabilities, and they've been constantly pushing. Obviously, there's the balloon whole thing. They've been constantly pushing in different ways to kind of test our capabilities and are very creative in using non-traditional platforms and modalities to collect on our defense systems. Russia's pretty much preoccupied. They have their own activities that they do for covert collection, but the scale and broad approach that China's taken is usually they're the first culprit to point fingers at. But I just point those two examples out as we say UFOs and it sort of has this sort of cultural taboo, this sort of stigma, but within the defense intelligence community now, it's become an unavoidable pressing matter of national security interest, right? You have these objects invading your airspace, disrupting operations. That's not something you can just ignore or sweep under the rug. You actually have to address that. So that's, I think, one of the main, and for good reason, a priority focus, right? But because I have this other background in physics and philosophy and thinking through these larger questions, you brought up the whole point of, okay, if we actually have to reckon with the object level question here, which is not the bureaucratic process or the political process or where we are in this sort of negotiation between different power centers and the bureaucracies and the different intelligence and defense communities and the political system, that's obviously, the nitty gritty where we are now. But if you want to zoom out and actually try to get to the core of what does this imply and how are we actually going to try to understand it on a more fundamental level, not just as some glowing objects in the sky or something that's zipping around that we can't explain. I think you actually have to really get to these foundational questions that occupy lots of people, which is what's the nature of life and intelligence? What's the nature of consciousness? What are the basic rules of physics that any advanced intelligence could potentially exploit? And those are the big open questions, right? We're aggressively trying to get a better handle on them, but we don't have a unified theory of physics. We don't really have a satisfactory explanation of consciousness. That's a naturalistic one, and we don't really understand what are the criteria for life or intelligence in the universe. Right? These are the basic open questions, and so you can use sort of the concept of UAP or non-human intelligence as a prism that you can sort of try to pull these different philosophical and scientific threads together, and then you can try to paint a certain picture of what you think is happening. But you have to really trace things back to basic understanding of fundamental physics, philosophy, and sort of try to integrate a whole different set of different domains of human knowledge to try to understand what could explain UAPs.
Yeah, and my assumption is there doesn't have to be a singular answer. There could be multiple answers.
Yes, in fact, when we first spoke about this, I kind of have a canonical, distribution of possible explanations for any sort of broadly considered UAP. Sort of is either sensor malfunction, right? There's gonna be categories of UAP that are just phantasms. They're just mistakes. Right, there's a sensor malfunction, observer error. We just made a mistake, right? Then there is essentially sort of misunderstood but real objects, right? So it was a actual balloon or a bug or a bird or whatever, and the sensor was fine, but just because of the trick of the light or the parallax or whatever it was, you thought it was performing in ways that were anomalous when actually it was not anomalous, right? And then there's the third category, which is the object you're detecting actually displays anomalous performance characteristics. It
But
actually,
we're there
well,
on some.
yeah, exactly. But then you could say, but it's human-derived technology, right? It's really exotic. It's really anomalous. It's real, but it's prosaically human. It's just from an aspect of human knowledge that is not publicly available. We've got secret R&D programs doing all sorts of crazy Star Wars stuff. This is just one of those crazy R&D programs that we have developed some crazy Star Wars stuff. And then the fourth category is real objects displaying exotic, anomalous performance that are non-human derived. And those are the basic four categories, like mistake, and there wasn't anything there, mistake, and there was something there, but it was normal, something really exotic, but human derived, or something really exotic that's non-human derived. And I think these are not mutually exclusive. I think you're going to see examples of all the broad umbrella of UAPs is going to be a distribution of those four things. And I think the latter two, right, obviously the most interesting, and they're not mutually exclusive either, right? If we had access to, say, category 4, and we were able to figure out how it works, then we could create category 3, right? Those would be sort of correlated sort of phenomenon. And so I don't rule any of those out, but that's kind of the mental map.
Where are you spending most of your time in, though? The latter two?
I've been spending most of my time thinking about, the more fundamental physics and sort of philosophical questions that then you have to grapple with to truly understand category 4.
Okay.
Right? Category 3 is interesting, but I'm also, in favor of keeping category 3 secret, right? Like if we had some special capabilities that are like war-winning capabilities that would be important for strategic deterrence or actual, strategic advantage in a conflict scenario over China, I definitely don't want that to be compromised. That's why we spend all this money, is to protect category 3. But category 4, that's non-government information, right? The existence of non-human intelligence is not something the government can classify. It's like the existence of the moon. It's just a natural phenomenon. This is the nature of intelligence in the universe. That's not something the government can or has a moral, ethical right to classify. Category 3, they definitely have a legal and ethical right to classify that. I think it's very important to distinguish between category 3 and category 4, man-made, especially U.S. government-derived technology platforms, and non-human intelligence-derived technology, because we have systems of government, of law, of political legitimacy that gives the government a right to protect and keep category 3 secret. But those protections do not extend to category 4, right? And I think we need to separate those things out and then actually have a social and political and philosophical and scientific framework that's prepared to then take that category 4 seriously and to provide explanations both at a scientific level and to the mass public that that can reckon with that. And so that's where I think a lot of work needs to go, because it's been, of course, shrouded in such taboo. You actually don't have sufficient brain power in say the white world of scientists, of philosophers, of people in different professions of responsibility to take that seriously and then apply different analytic methodologies and do hard cognitive work to actually try to build policy frameworks, scientific and analytic frameworks, and philosophical frameworks for category 4. So that's I think where a lot of work needs to go, because if the Senate is sending this signal that they could pass this bill, set up this independent review board that starts doing this important work, develops these control disclosure campaign plans, well, civil society is going to have to engage with that in a very serious way. Academia, right? Politics, religion. These are all going to be key stakeholders in that conversation, and they should start thinking those through now, right? And I think we actually do have pretty good useful frameworks to start with, right? We are starting to think about physics in potentially a new way. Philosophy is starting to reckon with a distribution of approaches to consciousness that were previously taboo or are now considered very, very sort of live hypotheses.
What does that mean? You mentioned you're concentrating on the consciousness side of things at the moment. What does that actually mean?
So I think if you actually you can come at it from both directions. So you can what does UAPs mean for physics and philosophy? And you can start from the UAP sort of domain. You can sort of go out into answering potential philosophical or questions about physics, or you can go the other direction. You can start with what we're currently thinking, and independent of UAPs. Just start where is the sort of current frontier and discourse in frontiers of physics and in frontiers of philosophy, or philosophy of mind, philosophies of intelligence, of consciousness, of causation, complexity. And you can start to look at those different intellectual strands of work, take those seriously, and then see how they might apply to UAPs, right? So I try to do both. Like it's not an either or. But in particular, in philosophy of mind, and this is motivated right out of in the UAP domain, and even in official government discourse now, there is a recognition that the sort of nuts and bolts of the objects go hand in hand with sort of anomalous cognitive phenomena, meaning the psychological effects of close encounters with these objects reported by military witnesses, close observers, as the UAP Disclosure Act calls them. They actually define close observers as individuals that have a close observation of UAPs, and also then experience different psychological, medical, biological effects that the government has been studying for a while. And so there is a effect on consciousness. There's an effect on whether perceptions of time, whether you lose a sense of time, or is almost
Lou Elizondo said about people who've been close to the craft, they lose like the perception of time.
Yeah, that's a common sort of phenomenology.
Is that a gravity thing?
I mean, you could then search for different explanations. You have the basic symptom or the basic reported psychological experience, and then you put that as a data point that you would then try to construct an explanation for. And it could be, as a time dilation effect of gravity, or it could be something completely different, right? It could just be, an advanced ability to manipulate human perception directly, right? Kind of remote Neuralink, disruption to your normal processing capabilities, or advanced sort of, we have capabilities right now to basically, cause neurophysiological effects at a distance using sort of microwave beam weapons, essentially, right? We can affect sort of phonons in the neural water. We can stimulate, hallucinatory auditory perceptions. That's like the more acute ones. There's like more crude ones of just like ride control. We can make you feel like you're being microwaved, like extreme intense heating without actual any radiative damage, right? It's just stimulating the sort of proprioception in your skin to make you think like you're on fire when you're not. So we've invested a lot of money like already right now to manipulate human perception to either cause, acute or more subtle effects. And so you can imagine like scaling that sort of capability up, right? And you could have all sorts of sophisticated ways of manipulating human perception. And so this is just, okay, we need to take all these data points in, not just like radar, or not just, studies of physical materials, but the effects on human consciousness, the effects on human perception. And so those are just like scientific data points, right? To sort of motivate then looking at how we think about, well, normal human consciousness. What do we think? What's going on with that, right? And then look to both scientific and philosophical paradigms to try to get our arms around it.
So, okay, so you think this is like a Copernican moment?
I think it could be. I mean, humans, we are a relatively new intellectual species, right?
Yeah.
In the sense of like the last 400 years since maybe Galileo in 1623 kind of first formulated kind of a scientific mathematical paradigm that is essentially what bootstrapped up the Enlightenment and sort of scientific practice and has given us the wonders of technological civilization, right? We're able to mathematize reality, come up with models to understand natural phenomenon, and then create kind of an integrative core theory now, which is essentially standard model plus general relativity, that is extremely successful. And science has been extremely successful, almost too successful, to the point where we actually can no longer create experiments that deviate from the core theory. So we're kind of stuck right now, right? Like the standard model and general relativity are so good at prediction that every experiment we'd be able to run with maybe some boundary cases, basically confirms those theories. But we know that those two theories, the core theory, the components of the core theory, are like mutually inconsistent for many different reasons. But we know that basically we don't actually have a good root understanding of reality, even though the best theories we've come up with are kind of the limits of what we've been able to develop experiments to test.
Is that incompatibility relativity with the quantum world?
Yeah, that's basically kind of the bottom line, right? Is that we have two different pictures of the universe, one for the very small, one for the very large, and they are very successful within their respective domains. Quantum theory for very small things, general relativity for the cosmos at large, large objects. where those different forces dominate, gravity versus the standard model forces, strong, weak, and electromagnetic force. And so we've been really successful the past 100 years, especially at constructing these theories, developing experiments, really test them to extreme high degree of precision. And we've then developed technology, nuclear weapons, computers, quantum sensors. We've been able to do like crazy stuff using this basic physics knowledge. And so we're still exploiting that physics knowledge for useful technology. But that basic physics knowledge really hasn't moved a lot in the last 50 years.
Where's the incompatibility?
So there's kind of a more fundamental incompatibility in there's different types of incompatibility. Like the basic one is that when you try to renormalize gravity to make it a quantum theory, you get these infinities basically that sort of blow the math up, and it just doesn't work. You can't quantize gravity in a way that we have to be able to quantize these other sort of fundamental forces. So we've been able to quantize, meaning make in terms of a discrete theory, theories of light, theories of the strong, which is basically the theory of electromagnetism, the strong and the weak nuclear force. So the standard model gives us particles that we have sort of a good sense of their mathematical behavior as part of these different symmetry groups that define the standard model. Gravity, when we try to quantize that, we can sort of jam it in, but we do it in a very arbitrary way, and it doesn't actually give us what we want in terms of an explanation of gravity. And so there's a basic incompatibility. Like general relativity essentially is a theory of smooth manifolds, right? Like the universe essentially is defined as a space-time manifold with a certain geometric structure. And general relativity basically says gravity is just a deformation in that structure, right? The classic kind of metaphor is, it's the sort of stretching of space itself, right? So gravity is just essentially a deformation in a 3+1 space-time manifold. So heavy objects deform space-time, more intensively, and objects want to, go through, want to basically travel on sort of geodesic lines, and that naturally leads to paths that we explain as following the force of gravity.
So I know it and I see it and I can understand it, but I don't fully understand it. I don't fully understand the warping of space-time. Mm-hmm. I've always struggled with that idea. Like, it can be explained. I understand why gravity has this pull. I understand it, but I don't understand it. You know what I mean?
And that's actually going back to UAPs and everything. Like, people have a folk, like FOLK, worldview, a folk physics, right? That is perfectly fine to get through your daily existence with, right? Like, you don't need to understand that space-time is malleable to navigate our everyday existence, right? Like, even though we know this table is mostly empty, right? Like, the electrons that are in those orbital shells actually are, fill up a very tiny amount of actual volume. Like, most of the hard objects we think about are just hard from the perspective of, sort of Coulomb forces, right? Like the electrical repulsion between electrons in my hand and the table. And so we have this folk sense that this table is dense, solid wood. But if you have a different perspective from the perspective of, say, what an atom actually is, well, your mental view of what the table is actually very different, right? And so the same mental models of space-time, we have kind of this static stage-like view where, it's just kind of a box filled with stuff, right? And the box is kind of the static and eternal. The box itself is not made of anything. The box doesn't change. There's just stuff in the box bouncing around, doing stuff. That's the pure kind of Newtonian picture from the 1700s, basically. But the Einsteinian revolution was the recognition that actually that's not correct. That the box is actually meaningful, and can be deformed. In fact, increasingly modern physics is telling us that space-time is actually not fundamental. That it actually emerges from some other process, from some other structural dynamics that gives rise to something like space at a scale that we exist at. And so the whole direction of intellectual endeavor for the past few hundred years has been proposing essentially new accounts of the world by postulating and sort of painting a picture of reality in a way that is not obvious to your common sense, right? But can be formulated in sufficient mathematical precision that you can then design an experiment, that you can actually touch and interpret that that supports that more wild theoretical proposal, right? So like we now know in sort of modern physics that the world is a very weird place. Quantum mechanics is very weird. General relativity is very weird. It's not something that we have like easily interpretable reference points in our common sort of experience. But that doesn't mean you just ignore science. Like, no, I don't believe it, right? Okay, you can go about that. But like, we've constructed 21st century, civilization off of that knowledge, right? And so that is a trajectory I expect to continue, is that we will have to increasingly develop and then take seriously what would, to a common sense sort of folk model of reality, look crazy, right? Look wildly incompatible with our everyday intuition. And for folks that haven't been studying physics for a while, that would be like quite a radical jump. But for folks that have been paying attention to physics for the past 100 years, like we have had to make that uncomfortable jump from everyday intuition to pretty uncomfortable, non-intuitive pictures of the world. Like quantum mechanics telling us that things are fundamentally, probabilistic, and general relativity telling us that there is no such thing as a preferred reference frame. There's no time slice through reality.
Can you explain those in detail?
Yeah, so quantum mechanics, which of course is still debated to this day exactly how to interpret it, but it essentially is a very well-defined mathematical explanation of the very small constituents of the universe, right? So we think the universe in this picture is basically defined by an object in quantum mechanics called the wave function, right? So there's no actual like particle or like an electron. It's not like a point particle, and it's not actually a field. It's actually this mathematical object called a wave function that we can write down equations for, and it basically tells us that any system can be defined, completely in terms of this one mathematical object. We can basically write down its energy and its key properties, whether it's its spin, its charge, its mass, in terms of this wave function. And then we can evolve that wave function deterministically, meaning its state at any given time is just determined by this equation. So this wave function has this value now. If we evolve it, there's a classic equation called the Schrodinger equation, which basically says this is how you evolve the wave function through time. There's a different process in quantum mechanics for measurement, meaning there's a wave function, which is basically a superposition of all possible states that you could observe that system in. And until you observe it, the wave function defines essentially the probability of finding that system in any particular state when you observe it. Essentially, you take the amplitude and you square it, and that's what you get as terms of the eigenvalues for that wave function. And so there's kind of this mysterious process in canonical interpretations of quantum mechanics of the deterministic evolution of the Schrodinger wave function, and then the non-deterministic measurement process, which collapses, quote unquote, the wave function into a particular value that you observe. Because in everyday life, we don't observe the wave function. We don't observe all different possible states. We observe, discrete, precise, states. And so there's been this mystery of how to interpret that, right? Like we have a classical picture of reality in terms of discrete states, and we have this mathematical description from quantum mechanics that actually says, that's incomplete, right? There are other possible states the universe has selected for somehow through some process of measurement. And so people have looked to then maybe that there's a space for consciousness, is the brain or the mind collapsing the wave function. I think it's a bit of like taking two mysteries and just saying they're the same mystery. It's a bit, you have to do a lot more work to kind of connect those two things together. But there is sort of a mystery to quantum mechanics itself. Just why do we see ourselves in a world that's discrete when quantum mechanics says, it should just be this smoothly evolving deterministic wave function of all possible states? We don't see that. But when you do the math, that predicts experiments. So we have to find some way of interpreting quantum mechanics to give ourselves this metaphysical answer to a question that the math itself isn't going to give you. But the math is just the math. It predicts results of experiments. It works. So when I was taught in undergrad, when you go through this and you're like, well, that doesn't make any sense. Like, what is measurement? And they go, it doesn't matter. Don't ask those questions. It works, right? The math works, gives you the experiments, it gives you the data. You can confirm the data. You can confirm that in the experiments. You can build whatever devices you want. Go about your day. Don't ask the questions what it means. It's fine, right? And so this is the sort of divide between physics and philosophy. Physics is, come up with a mathematical model that can predict phenomenon that you can design experiments to test. If those experiments work, Great. Go about go about your day. Philosophers want to know, well, what does it actually mean? What is it telling us about reality? Right?
Okay, I'm going to level with you.
Yeah.
I didn't really understand most of that. I don't know about you.
Nope.
I did my best.
Yeah.
But is the need to know, or the need for the maths to work, is that in knowing that, is that how we know how to build things that work?
Yeah.
It's because of that. That's, the stuff we use. Are there things we build, for example, certain technologies or, certain weapons or certain radars or communication devices, the science of relativity enables that to work.
100%.
But at the same time, there are things that work because of our mathematical understanding of quantum physics.
Yes, both. We use general relativity in GPS to correct for the fact that time ticks a little bit slower in orbit.
Yeah.
We use quantum mechanics to design sensors right now, right, that can be extremely sensitive, say, at detecting submarines, right? So they're called quantum sensors, extremely sophisticated, very tiny devices that can, they're very sensitive to tiny little, perturbations, right? So they're just extremely sensitive at detecting, say, acoustic noise or changes to sort of the gravitational field in a particular area. So we're using this science, right? We're using this basic understanding of physics to construct devices that we are using in our everyday life. And that's basically what human civilization does. It's just assembling more complex objects that exploit the degrees of freedom that the universe apparently allows, right? You can think about the rules of physics are like the rules of the game of the universe. We don't know all the rules, but when you know some of the rules, you can then, design objects that take advantage of those properties.
And if we knew more, we might be able to do crazier, wilder things.
Yeah.
Like mathematically, Einstein proved wormholes, right? Mathematically proved it.
I mean, there are solutions to the Einstein field equations that called the the Einstein-Rosen bridge, that is essentially allows disconnected regions of space-time to be connected in a way that is, topologically continuous, meaning there's no discontinuities. It doesn't blow up the math. You can have in classical formulations of general relativity, you can have wormholes. Whether those are real things that can exist in our universe, this is the difference between a model that is coming from one scientific paradigm that makes certain predictions about what's possible in that paradigm, and then reality itself, right? Like we're just trying to develop maps that cover reality, right? And we don't have a map that right now covers all of reality in all of its different scales and all of its different features. We have good maps for different parts that we can observe, but we don't have like a single unified map for all of reality. And that's what we're trying to build, but we don't have one yet. So we can't really state definitively what is or isn't possible, right? So when people say, okay, these craft aren't, how could they get here from another star system? Nothing we have can go that fast. It would take light years to go these distances. Okay, but those are the current constraints that we have from our current understanding of physics and our current technology. It's quite hubristic to think that that's the ultimate limit imposed by reality itself. And an advanced intelligence, almost by definition, is going to have better understanding of the degrees of freedom that exist in the universe that it could develop technology for. So that's, it seems that's the territory you have to play in to try to account for what could be, advanced technology that's here.
Right, so, and things that seem quite advanced to us because we're essentially a young species could be quite a basic understanding of the universe.
Yeah, I mean, we say basic, it's always kind of a relative game, right?
Yeah,
I mean, we are, we're evolved apes, right? Like we're relatively new on the scene.
Jumping up and down on a
rock. Like we just figured out, how to, burn some stuff underneath like a, aluminum tube and launch it into space. Like
we've solved propulsion.
Yeah, it's like, okay, that's the limit, right, guys? It's just blowing up some, having a controlled explosion, right, to launch something just like a few miles into space. That's like super advanced to us, right? I'm sure that will be looked to us crude in just like 50 years or 100 years, right? So everything is, and of course, our technological paradigm is changing quite rapidly in like an accelerating pace, right? So we have, this sense that we're on this trajectory in the next 5, 10, 20 years of a lot of different technologies, maybe not propulsion, basic physics, but understanding of biology, of computing converging in particular. So with AI, with synthetic biology. And so you try to project, advanced intelligence. It isn't just going to be on this dimension of basic physics knowledge, right? Physics is sort of the foundational, block in that pyramid, but you build up a whole tower of knowledge, right, about how to construct complicated objects, right? The universe, at least to my mind, is like a system that's essentially producing complicated objects, right? Like human beings are a complicated object, and there's a history to us, right? Like we didn't just sprout into existence. And there's this sort of scientific approach that's now been put forward. It's still kind of not the dominant paradigm, but it's a serious proposal called assembly theory. And this is just kind of this basic common sense idea that like any object that you encounter in your life, or say a molecule or a shoe, it's a result of some process of construction, right? It didn't just pop into existence. It has a characteristic history, right? So any given molecule, you can ask this question: what are the minimum number of steps that it takes to construct that object from like more basic components? So like a molecule of like H2O of water has just like three basic atoms that had to be constructed. Like the universe had to do some computational, in our language, chemical work to bring those three basic things together to create a new object called the H2O molecule. That's a relatively simple object, but it has a characteristic assembly pathway, right? You had to take 2 atoms of hydrogen and 1 atom of oxygen, and you had to bring them together in a sufficient, physical space to react to generate, H2O. That's basic chemistry, but in the language of assembly, that path that it takes is its assembly path. And the assembly number is how many discrete steps, right, chemical reactions had to take place to create that object. So any object, basically you can construct its assembly number, its assembly pathway. What's the minimum number of steps it takes to construct a given object? And in this sense, even a small object like a complicated protein, right, or DNA that looks, complicated but very small, could be very large in time, meaning its assembly pathway could be extremely large. Could go, essentially 4 billion years back to the beginning of life on Earth. It took 4 billion years to create you and me, right? Like our assembly pathway goes back 4 billion years. So while we're relatively small objects, like in space, we're very large in time, and we embody a huge amount of information, right? So essentially, there's it's like a blockchain, right? Like the universe is constructing complicated objects that embody their history, right? And almost the definition of complexity is just essentially the number of steps that it takes to create that object, and also how many copies of it there are, right? So there are
the number of opportunities to create that.
Yes,
because we can think it's like, are we alone? Is life unique? This is the rabbit hole I went down last night. But observable universe, 2 trillion galaxies, and I don't know how many suns. I was reading about the Drake equation, and it said that the ranges from naught, like just only in the Milky Way alone, but depending on how you enter the numbers, it's a range of naught to potentially, I think, millions of other life forms within the Milky Way alone. And so, if you start to think of the universe as the observable universe, 2 trillion galaxies, but the unobservable universe now being... Because that was another thing, by the way. I've always lived with the idea the universe is 13.8 billion years old. No, the observable universe is 13.8 billion years old. We don't know how far. I don't know what your thesis of this is, whether it's infinite, but if there's trillions upon trillions of galaxies, or even if you go as far as infinite, the reality is there will be other life elsewhere at different stages.
Yeah, I think this is sort of the basic sort of law of large numbers, right? And then if it could happen here, you basically are forced to decide either the processes that give life to intelligent life are so difficult to sort of all chain together that probabilistically we're very, very unlikely, right? And therefore, within a certain space-time volume, you would only expect one advanced civilization to emerge, per say 1 million galaxies or whatever. If that was the math, then you would expect to be kind of the only one around, right? The nearest neighbor would be really far away. There's a economist and physicist named Robin Hanson who's probably done the best to try to bound this assessment, these basic parameters for the frequency of life in the universe. He's got a few papers that he's published on this, and it's using a few key assumptions, but basically kind of version of the Drake equation. The big the key feature, the key part of the argument, though, is like how difficult it is to create life like us. Like how many lucky rolls of the dice do you have to get to human to have like advanced human intelligence from like basic chemical soup, right? Because that essentially.
How many leaps are there in there?
How many leaps are there? Because if it's only, let's say, if it's just 3 really unlikely steps, right? And if say it takes 1 billion years of just like, probabilistic rolls of the dice for evolution to figure out that next trick that it needs to say to go from, basic sort of monocellular life to, multicellular complex life. There's some basic, biophysical tricks that have to be figured out. And if it just takes 1 billion years to figure out each trick, okay, after 3 billion years, maybe each trick takes 1 billion years to kind of like randomly figure out. Then that's going to set like a parameter that you would put into the equation to say how unlikely it is for life to evolve given certain conditions. And he does his best to kind of bound that. And you can look at his paper, come up with his math. I think there are wide uncertainties though, right? Where I think you can go to the one side of that assessment and basically say it's relatively common, meaning that the special tricks that life on Earth figured out, any planet with suitable conditions, in the galaxy could probably figure out, right? And so you do the math, and it's probably reasonably likely that at least a small number in the galaxy figured it out. But if they figured it out 1 billion years before us, that's a lot of time for advanced life to develop systems of technology to explore the rest of the galaxy and actually, say, develop self-replicating probes that could basically colonize the galaxy in a few million years. And so this sets a boundary constraint on what sorts of life you would expect to encounter. Either it's life that's like remakes the matter that it comes into contact with, in which case, well, we haven't really seen that. Like the UAPs that we're encountering are not like taking over the solar system and turning us all into computer goo for its own machines, right? Like that hasn't happened. So you have to sort of exclude that as like part of the explanation for what sort of life could be coming here. It's some other form of intelligence that has no objective to turn us into, computronium glue, right? So you'd have to load in other assumptions about, well, not just the pure technological development of advanced intelligence in the universe, but almost like sociopolitical, right? Like what sort of civilization, right? Emerges? What sort of political governance obtains in an advanced intelligence civilization?
Do you think sometimes with this we think too much along the lines of what we are and expect something similar? Like we start with the premise that would DNA would it be carbon-based life forms? Because it wouldn't have to be carbon-based. We know it doesn't have to be, but we start with that and we assume it's going to develop into maybe a being that has 2 arms and 2 legs and some kind of cognitive brain function. But is that arrogant to think like that?
Certainly. I think
sorry, just throw something in there. My brother's here. I remember this. I always remember this. We had a biology teacher called Mr. Fuchs. And I always remember him saying, if there is life on other planets, it probably looks nothing like we look. The chance of it looking the same is infinitely small.
Yeah, we actually don't really have a good theory of life, which you would kind of want to have a more fundamental theory of life to then answer the question, what does life look like in other paths of development, right? That's kind of the question, right? How much...
Sorry, I'm jumping in a bit. But even like replicating cells, is that a fluke?
Yeah, and we actually don't have good... Like there's maybe within certain narrow domains of, say, exobiology or, different parts of sort of the scientific communities, there's some consensus, but really no universal consensus as to the actual emergence of life. There's different stories. Like you need some sort of autocatalytic chemistry, sort of, physics, sort of computational chemists look at that sort of explanation. You need some sort of bootstrapping mechanism as just the basic foundation. But like, could you just have RNA-based life? Do you need DNA? Could you just have, like viruses? Are they a form of life? Viruses, don't have, they can't endogenously replicate. They need other creatures to survive. There's like different basic chemical substrates, right? Could you have, maybe silicon-based life forms, not carbon-based life forms? Maybe the basic atomic chemistry works out. You can create complicated structures. There's even more exotic forms. Is like, well, what do we mean by life, right? Life, this is what I was talking about, assembly theory, is like, we don't actually have a good, clean definition of life, right? This is what I was saying. You need to have some more abstract theoretical model that you can mathematically define. These are the complexity conditions that we say, beyond this threshold that we can define mathematically, this object is a living object, right? And it's different not like in an ontological way. It's not like, oh, there's now this like new life thing that exists. There's just a criteria that you're mathematically defining that, okay, when you have just amino acids going back and forth and doing reactions, that's not life. But as soon as you get some, say, autocatalytic structure that generates a reinforcing pattern that it survives over a sufficient long period of time and generates, in say, assembly theory, multiple copies of complex objects, we would sort of put the label life around that, right? And then if we were looking out into the universe at another planet, we now have a mathematically abstracted definition, right? That isn't specified in terms of carbon or certain, sort of biological features on Earth that we're applying over there. It's a much more abstract, mathematically, general model of life, and we can then look at the different chemical processes or different structures that are being formed in a different planet and say, okay, that shares the same mathematical features of complexity that we have defined in terms of our theory of life. Therefore, that's life, right? That's kind of what you have to do. You can't just have this like gut feel. Does it look like life, right? That's not a scientific model, right? Scientific model has to have like mathematical predictions. This is what life is. This is the the system of explanations that we've constructed, and then we can go out and we can say, in a more objective way, this is what life is. And importantly, though, having such a theory then allows you to distinguish between objects, because any object you encounter, right, you don't know you don't know its history, right? So the key question then is, what's a natural object versus what's a, say, artificial object, right? And so assembly theory actually kind of gives you a way to distinguish between those two things, because a natural process of generating complicated objects, which we call, say, life, tends to generate multiple copies, right? So they have both a high assembly number, meaning there's a long chain of steps to take that nature had to take to create that complicated object, like evolution in particular, and there's many copies of them, right? That's what DNA is. There's many, many trillions and trillions of copies of the same object on planet Earth that all have this very long assembly history. And so life, essentially gives you this explanation of what life is. I mean, assembly theory gives you an explanation of what life is in terms of things that have a high assembly number, meaning this long process of sort of accumulated construction, and there's many copies. It also gives you an explanation of, say, artificial objects, which also have usually a long history, but limited number of copies, right? So there's not too many computers, say, relative to DNA in the world. Right? There's a lot of computers, but not that many relative to DNA. There's probably tens of orders of magnitude more DNA copies than copies of any particular computer.
But we could get to the point where the next evolutionary step is only artificial life at some point. So other civilizations that we come into contact with have reached the artificial stage. The biological stage has been killed off. It's unnecessary, or just those interplanetary steps are only performed by artificial life. That
is exactly, you just completely short-circuited where I was going to go with this, because it's exactly what you can see human civilization heading. Kind of smart, well, why am I even here, And that's because we're in this interesting moment where, the history of life on planet Earth is sort of this natural process of selection, which generates objects, usually requires multiple copies, because nature has to basically explore many different possibilities to find one that works. That's because it's a basic search algorithm. The function of higher level intelligence, though, is it gives you like a new capability that didn't exist for most of life's evolution, which is to choose pathways for future exploration, right? More intentionally, right? And that then generates a much different pattern of complex objects, right? To the point where if you let that run for a while, you're not going to be able to distinguish anymore those different parameters, right? There's going to be many, many copies of things that all have a very long assembly history that, from this functional perspective of assembly theory, would be identical to kind of the traditional processes of life on Earth, but would be entirely sort of technologically directed. And so this is what you would then be looking for sort of advanced signatures of technology in a different civilization, or here, right? That maybe these objects that we're encountering are products of essentially, advanced sort of 3D printing, nanoassembly, sort of molecular construction. They're like one-time use. They can just, spin up the machine. It spits out this, orb or craft for a particular purpose. It's kind of like just one-time use, right? It's like things are extremely cheap to create. Right, so they're kind of, it's also why they wouldn't care too much if they,
it's kind of their version of a drone.
Yeah, it's extremely cheap. Like China can produce millions of drones, right, coming out of these factories. Imagine if you could do that. You could customize each drone in a 3D printer and send it off to do a particular mission. You wouldn't care if it comes back. It just whatever, right? I can just spit out any number of copies that I want. And if the part that is more uncomfortable for us, though, is that we're comfortable thinking about in terms of copies of technological objects like drones or computer probes or whatever. We're less comfortable thinking about it in terms of biology, right? But biology is a structured piece of material, right? Like we don't know how to like create synthetic organisms to the degree of complexity that we can create synthetic, pieces of technology, right? Like complicated, aircraft or drones. But we're heading in that direction of being able to create synthetic life forms, right? We're like, this is on the trajectory for the next few decades. And so you could play this out, and those things could start to converge, where there's not much of a distinction anymore with, say, 3D printing a biological organism to perform a certain function, and 3D printing, a drone-like orb craft, right? Those are just different morphologies of the same basic ability to produce something to perform different functions. So this is.
But wouldn't you be better at 3D? Wouldn't it be better to 3D print computers, synthetic computers, rather than synthetic biology? Because it's less resilient, especially over long distances. There has to be different inputs. For a computer, it's just energy. For us, it's more than energy. Well, it's energy, but it's in the form of, we have to have water. We have to have, like a food energy source. Like it's a computer seems more resilient, or you could build it more resilient.
I think
Does it come down to whether you think biological consciousness is important?
I think form follows function in just an abstract sense. And so, like interstellar travel, you probably don't want to have like biological components in there because they're probably not going to endure long enough. But when you're, say, exploring a particular new planet, right, there's a lot of flexibility that comes from having a biological avatar, a biological robot, right, that can manipulate objects, that can walk around, that can do things. Like most of our robots are pretty crude, right? And any given robot that's made of material is going to have some sort of maintenance, requirement. And so it might just be pretty. We don't actually know the limit, like which is more difficult to construct. If it turns out it's actually not that hard to create, synthetic biological robots, then those could be very useful, right, in a particular context. Say you're on a planet and you want to explore. You want to collect biological samples. You want to go fly around. You want to drop off some things, pick up some things. Maybe you want to interact with living creatures on that planet, and maybe you need some physical embodiment to engage with those people that wouldn't just want to talk to a glowing orb in the sky.
What would be the difference between like a synthetic biological peat versus a naturally born peat?
Well,
is it purely the assembly process?
This is getting more to like my cup of tea in like philosophy of mind and philosophy of identity. And there's lots of thought experiments that philosophers love to construct in terms of trying to tease apart our intuitions about these things. Like, what do we think about peat as like an object in the universe? Like how coherent of a concept is that when I say take different parts of peat and I remove them over time, right? When does peat go away? If I replace each neuron in your brain one for one with a silicon chip that replicates exactly the activation patterns of firing, maybe even simulates the internal neurochemistry of that neuron, and I do that one-for-one swap, in a controlled process, say over a long period of time, to the point where it's 90% biology, 10% silicon, all the way to 90% silicon, 10% biology, and I keep doing that till there's no biological neurons left, and everything is now in silicon. I've now, potentially, replaced your entire mental apparatus, the thing that's doing your thinking, the embodiment of your conscious identity. I've now instantiated that in a new substrate, right? Can I make copies of that now? What happens to you? These are the basic questions of philosophical, identity. And then there's the question: okay, well, if I can then, all the sensory information that your brain gets from your body that creates a world for you to exist in, that gives you a sense that you are an embodied creature in a real world, I can simulate that. And this is, of course, the question of a simulation, right, or virtual reality. How do I distinguish between a simulated reality and a quote real reality?
But is consciousness only a biological phenomenon?
Well, yeah, these are related, but maybe different questions, right? One
Yeah,
is
but
the,
if you're removing my brain, one molecule at a time, replacing it with silicon, is that what am I at that point? If I've got the same personality, the same decision making process, still tell everyone to fuck off. Like, am I still Pete or am I a synthetic Pete?
Yeah, I think you need a philosophically grounded theory of identity to answer that question. And I think there are, right now, different sort of vociferously competing camps. There are some people that believe, yes, 100%, there's no difference a meaningful difference in terms of the consistency and coherence of conscious identity and memory and all the things we think about when it's like, who am I? Between instantiation in wetware in the biology and instantiation in sort of silicon hardware. All that really matters from this view is the pattern of sort of computational information processing that takes place in your brain. If I can emulate that to a sufficient, maybe, arbitrary degree of accuracy in a different substrate, say, silicon hardware, then all of the features of Pete come along with that, right? It's just all that it is consciousness. It just reduces to patterns of computational information processing, sort of functional relationships between different processes in the brain. If I can replicate those in a different substrate, then I get consciousness along for the ride. So from that theory of consciousness in the mind, you could have fully equivalently conscious, morally valuable minds in silicon. There are different, camps in philosophical schools that reject that actually hold that there's one version that's like biological essentialism, that there's some specialness to biology, be hard to motivate. There's some.
I agree. By the way,
yeah,
because it's not synthesized.
Well, the question though is like what conditions, like that experiment that I just did of like mental thought experiment of replacing one for one, like. A biological essentialist would have to specify some criteria along that process that says, is it 50%? That's when consciousness blinks out, right? I mean, we haven't done the experiment. This actually could be done as maybe like Elon in 20 years could do this experiment. Maybe is like take a human brain. Again, the ethics of this might be questionable, but like in theory, you could have somebody like self-report as their brain is being replaced with silicon chips. And they could, describe have a whole battery of sort of self-reported metrics of their first-person subjective experience. And you would try to measure using, that plus maybe really highly precise sort of functional fMRI to try to see, like, does anything change in either the functional MRI, the patterns of activation, or the self-reported consciousness experiences as you sort of replace their brains with sort of silicon equivalents. And you could see, is there a disruption?
I don't think you get to a hard line.
I mean, this is where philosophy is somewhat struggles with answering the question. It just gives you a better way of defining the right question to ask. And then there are some questions that maybe you could do experiments on in the future to get a better handle on. And there's others that maybe will remain, right? And you just have to like feel comfortable with a certain sort of intuitive orientation, right? Yeah. Some people are just really comfortable with a materialist orientation, that the universe is fundamentally just physical stuff all the way down, and that anything that's like emergent is just sort of a higher level description, but not fundamental. And there's other, folks that are more comfortable with, say, a dualistic picture of the world, where actually there is physical stuff and then there's mental stuff. And the mental stuff, or qualitative phenomenal experience, is a equally equivalent and important, like irreducible feature of reality, just as much as physical stuff. That's like property dualism or substance dualism. And then there's, versions in between. I sort of find myself attracted to sort of versions in between, which are essentially physicalists from the outside and sort of, conscious realists from the inside. In the sense, yeah.
Because I'm thinking like consciousness is it really just biologically programmed into us? It's just how the brain operates. Because when you see somebody can get brain damage, they can come with a completely different personality afterwards. Something's altered in them, and so part of their personality is from there. So is it just biological synthesis inside us? Like, do I really exist as me as Pete, or is my brain telling me that Pete exists?
I mean, every day you wake up and you're reconstituting your personal identity from memory and from the coherence of your physical surroundings and a sort of embodied continuity. But there's a break in your conscious identity right when you go to sleep. Right. And yet we have no philosophical issues with that. Like Pete this morning is the same Pete as last night. Even though, there is no like conscious chain that connects those two, right? There's a physical chain, the same physical material, right, was sitting in the bed that night and the one that woke up, and it has the same verbal reports about who it is and who it is. But, you, first person experience, have to rely, you have to trust your own memory, right? That could all have been simulated, right? You could have just been loaded in with the program that says, this is the current state of Pete, and this current state of Pete is going to believe that it had all the it has all the memories of being the Pete from the last week, 2 months, 45 years or whatever, right? So this basic skeptical philosophical line of argument can sort of always be taken. Like you could always be the victim of some extremely advanced manipulation, simulation. There's no, I think, bulletproof philosophical argument to sort of anchor belief in a like irreducible, high confidence way. You just have to kind of get through your life. Like radical skepticism is not a survival function, right? Like if you don't believe in the bus, that's fine. But those people who disbelieve in the reality of buses don't tend to stick around or propagate their ideas. And so, yeah, this is where the abstract philosophical discourse kind of can sort of delaminate from, okay, well, you have to live, you have to go through existence with certain basic assumptions. And this is where, like, we are technologically, though, potentially going to create the ability to simulate experiences with an increasing degree of realism and fidelity. And we could get to the point where we have a combination of, where it's not a philosophical argument anymore. It's almost like a real, practical, almost policy question of like, if people can plug themselves into, Neuralink +++, right? And can, flip off the external sensory switch and flip on a computational generated environment that to their first person experience looks like a real environment, we would have to ask this question then, okay, like how real is that simulated world, right? And then,
to say that this isn't that.
Exactly, right? And so there's a great philosopher, David Chalmers, who wrote a book a few years ago called Reality Plus that examines this question and takes very seriously the reality of virtual worlds. And he basically tells a, pretty straightforward argument that, on sort of three different buckets of philosophy, right? The first bucket is what's real. The second is how do we know what we know about what's real? And the third part is, well, what's valuable about living in any world? And so he tries to basically say that his argument is that simulated worlds, virtual worlds, are just as real as any other world that we could write down properties for. And that we have the same degree of sort of relationship of knowledge in a virtual world as we have to a stipulated real world. And that you can actually have real purpose, real meaning, real plans and relationships and fulfillments and, desires in a simulated world as in a real world. And so he tells this whole argument, and his, upshot is that actually virtual worlds, simulated worlds, are no different than a real world. In fact, they're just different labels that we would give. And so it's fundamentally like a meaningless question to ask. It's just, a different sort of stance on how you think about what world you exist in with respect to some maybe other supernatural world, right? That relationship between any given observer in any given world is always going to be limited, is always going to be subject to some set of constraints, and fundamentally disadvantaged with respect to whatever generated or whoever generated that world. And there's arguments from basic physics that sort of have this, you can motivate this idea in a sense of like it from bit, right? So in the 20th century, there's a physicist named Bryce DeWitt, and he started looking at the foundations of physics and quantum mechanics. And there was this sort of development of quantum information theory at the time that started to look at, okay, the basic principles of our theories of computation and our basic theories of quantum mechanics started to basically, come together. And it motivated him to think about, well, actually, the sort of the basement of reality isn't physical stuff. It's pure information. It's just bits. And so the stuff of the world comes from bits. So that was like this sort of first articulation of this idea that is very conciliant with the simulation hypothesis, right? And the simulation hypothesis, it's actually it from bit from it, meaning the its that we experience in our world come from bits, but those bits are being run, those are usually the software layer of some other hardware layer in a different reality. And so you can just chain those together, philosophically. You can just have an infinite chain of it from bits, from its, from bits, et cetera. I don't think it gets you anywhere, right? Because any given pattern of bits in this sense is just that's what reality is. And so if you have a simulated pattern of bits and a real pattern of bits, there's no distinction. They're just patterns of bits. And so,
but the question goes back to what created the its.
I mean, yeah, this is the
With
fundamental ontology, right?
And there always has to be a starting point somewhere.
Yeah, this is why I philosophically myself, I'm attracted more from an it from bit from consciousness kind of idea that actually places consciousness at the root of reality, and that you need something like the properties of consciousness to sort of undergird basic physics. And so that's sort of, there's a philosopher named Philip Goff who I really like. I don't have, I don't subscribe to his entire framework, but I really attracted to this idea that goes back to one of the more famous philosophers and mathematicians of the 20th century, Bertrand Russell. And he first pointed this out, 1920s, but it kind of like, nobody read his book, Analysis of Matter, until like 20 years ago. And he basically made this simple observation that like all of physics, the sort of mathematical paradigm that goes back to Descartes, is really just all about providing a mathematically defined description of reality in terms of the pattern of constraint, right? Physics basically tells us like the rules of chess. Think about, you could write down the rules of chess, but the rules of chess don't tell you what the chess pieces have to be made of. It doesn't say whether they have to be made of wood or glass or metal. The rules of chess are completely agnostic with respect to the question, what are chess pieces made of? It just says chess pieces have to have a certain functional form, and given that functional form, meaning a bishop or a knight or a pawn, then they have certain basic constraints. A pawn can only go, these steps forward or backwards, or forward, to take a piece, et cetera. And that's what physics is. Physics is just the rules of chess. Physics doesn't tell you what pieces have to be made of. And so we have this cognitive slip with physics because we're used to, the visualizations and descriptions and diagrams in physics textbooks, and people, the terms of electrons and protons and neutrons. Like we have some sort of mental image of like a little dot thing, and maybe it's like a color and it's spinning around. It's got some sort of property, but that's not in physics, right? That's just our mental imagery, right? Physics just says an electron has certain properties mathematically defined: mass, spin, and charge. That's it. There's nothing else in physics. That's all that an electron is just certain numbers in equations that behave a certain way. It doesn't say what an electron is. And so there's an open question, though, at the heart of physics, which is what is the stuff of reality, right? Even Stephen Hawking said, right, like even if we get to a final theory of physics, it'll just be a pattern of equations, it'll be a system of equations. The question is, though, like what breathes fire into the equations? What makes there to be a world for those equations to describe, right? There's some isness at the heart, at the beating sort of center of existence that, to me, is a separate argument you have to give. Is what consciousness is.
So if there's no consciousness, if there's no intelligent life, no consciousness, is there even a universe?
Well, yeah, we're getting, almost trivially, yes, right? In the sense that, it depends on how you want to define like a universe, right? Like you could.
Does this all exist without us, or is it the interface of the brain and physics that creates this?
I think to answer those philosophical questions, you need to point to a certain philosophical theory of metaphysics that you want to motivate independently, and then say, I have good reasons to think the metaphysics of the world is like this, and therefore when you ask me that question, I can say no because of my independently motivated theory of metaphysics. And in my independently motivated theory of metaphysics, consciousness is sort of the intrinsic nature of causation. Physics is the extrinsic nature of causation. It's just a pattern of constraint viewed from the perspective of an observer who experiences that pattern of constraint. So those are like two sides of the same coin, right? A door only has by definition two sides. There's no such thing as a one-sided door, right? So just like in my theory of causation, there's no such thing as just a physical reality, right? That would be the same sort of nonsensical way of saying there's a one-sided door, right? In my theory of causation, patterns of constraint, which we call physics, go hand in hand with, almost metaphysically require some receptivity at the base of reality that experiences the pattern of constraint. So there's both an intrinsic nature of reality and an extrinsic nature of reality. The intrinsic nature is consciousness. The extrinsic nature is patterns of constraint, is what we call physics. And that whole thing is just causation playing itself out. Causation is just the process of the universe, executing every possible sequence that it can, and then selecting down for any given observer is going to see some subset of all the different sequences that the universe is running.
I can't help but start at the most basic starting questions, and I'm always there's two questions. Well, it's kind of three questions. I'm always thinking about, and I'm always interested in the different thesis on it. Is the how it started, why actually throw another one in. Why then? Why? I mean, in terms of observable universe, we say 13.8 billion years ago, but why then? If not then infinite, so steady state. When it did happen, when say Big Bang Theory is correct, why did it create molecules, and why did it create atoms, and why did it create? Well, I don't know what the basic. You'll know better than me. The basic building blocks. Why did the laws of physics get created as they are? Why is the speed of light that? Why is there a nuclear force, a strong and a weak? And why is it? Why does this all happen? Like, there's no logic to it. There's no reason for a universe to spawn out of nothing.
Yeah.
And my head blows up.
There's, I think, 3, maybe 4 different branches of that tree that you can sort of decide to go down. One is just like brute fact acceptance. Not trying to answer the why question, just accept this is what it is. I'll never be able to know it. Again, that's the least satisfying branch, but that's like one branch. It's just bite the bullet. Random stuff happens. This is the world we happen to be in. It is what it is. Don't ask any more questions. The second is a supernatural explanation, meaning God or some higher entity sort of picked this particular nature of the universe to bring into existence. Right? There are infinitely many that capital He he could have created, and he created this one for purposes that are beyond our human understanding. That's like one branch of the tree, kind of a supernatural explanation. The third is what you might call like an anthropic sort of selection explanation. This is this is probably the more popular, in scientific circles now, that there are actually an infinite number of different possible universes that actually exist. In string theory, this is sort of like the string vacua. There's like 10 to the 500 different string theory solutions. And most of those, maybe almost all of them, give rise to sort of physically uninteresting, unstable, very, boring universes. Only the tiny number of solutions in, say, that string vacua space give rise to complex objects that can ask the question. So if you're a complex object asking the question, why do I exist in a world that can allow complex objects? Well, there's kind of there's an observer selection effect. You wouldn't be around to ask that question in any other universe. And this is essentially the fine-tuning question, right? Sort of the universe that we exist in seems to be fine-tuned for life. There's all sorts of physical parameters, like actual numbers in our physical theories that give values to certain constants, right? So a big one is the cosmological constant, which essentially sets the expansion rate of the universe itself, which we know is expanding. The universe, in fact, the rate of acceleration of the rate of expansion of the universe is actually accelerating. And it has a particular value. If that value was a little bit bigger, the universe would have inflated much faster than would have allowed, say, stable galaxies to create, or even stable forms of matter to exist in. If it was a little bit smaller, the universe would have like recollapsed to, like a big crunch. So the value of that cosmological constant seems to be, suitable for the existence of large-scale structure to obtain without any major disruptions to, the existence of the basic predicate of life. And so that's like the main popular explanation is that, for example, that cosmological constant could take on, any arbitrary value throughout the multiverse. In those universes where it takes on a variable that's not suitable for life, there's no life around to ask the question. So we happen to be around in this universe only because we're in the one that has the right values. It's kind of an unsatisfying explanation. And then there's the fourth. Yeah.
Sorry.
Yeah.
I buy that. I buy the fact that there's an idea of multiverse, and it's it's A/B test, and this is the one that has all the right parameters for us to reach this point where you and I are sat here having this conversation. But it still doesn't give me the answer to the spawning of the multiverse, because there's no answer to where does this universe exist, exist, and what's it expanding into. There's no answer to that. But what stops there being an infinite number of universes in different dimensions existing? Because it comes to exist out of nothing into nothing.
Yeah, I mean, this is where physics, ends and philosophy starts. Is like, well, the prime mover, right? This is, in any sort of version of this argument, whether it's in metaphysical context for the whole universe, or just in an epistemological sense of like how do we know what we know, is different. Either there's some sort of like infinite regress that you have to bite, that there's just an infinite chain of explanations that will never end, or there's some brute stopping point, some absolutely solid foundation upon which you can then base everything else. So either that's God or some supernatural principle that you point to that anchors the world, like your worldview. There's somewhere in between those.
I don't buy that either.
So there's a great book that you would, I think, appreciate because it tries to go in between these different explanations, none of which are very satisfactory.
Great.
And it's called Why. It's actually by the same philosopher I was mentioning before, named Philip Goff. And he tries to basically propose or motivate kind of a novel version of kind of that's in between naturalism and supernaturalism, right? So he basically, so his like the upshot of his view, and he gives obviously a book length argument for it, is that the laws of the universe have a purpose, right? That there is a purpose to the universe. That purpose isn't found in some sort of supernatural context of some sort of godlike purpose, but that nevertheless the universe is achieving a purpose as it evolves, right? And so he tries to go in between either just mindless mechanistic laws that are just computing the next state, tries to avoid that sort of more, say, depressing kind of sort of empty vision of the universe, without necessarily adopting a fully theistic view, where the universe is essentially a spiritual creation of some higher supernatural object, which a lot of scientists would sort of pick. You're loading in a whole bunch of extra metaphysical baggage that maybe you want for spiritual or metaphysical reasons, but are not motivated out of science. So he tries to take this narrow path, and he takes the fine-tuning argument very, very seriously, and he gives like a rigorous both scientific and philosophical case for this. And he has an important analysis of the fine-tuning problem that I don't think most people have understood, especially in the scientific communities, especially the folks in traditional physics that usually think this is a pretty solid argument. And he calls it the inverse gambler's fallacy. And it's a pretty simple argument, right? The idea is, imagine you with your buddy, you go into this big casino. You first walk in the door and you encounter a single guy at the craps table. And as soon as you come in, he just starts winning. He wins he's stacking. He's basically just cleaning up. He's an immense run of luck. You're watching this guy. He's had the most amazing run of luck that anyone's ever had in any casino that you've ever been a part of. And then you turn to your friend, you go, wow, the casino must be busy tonight. And your friend goes, how can you possibly make that inference? We've only seen this one guy have an incredible string of luck. And you go, well, the only explanation for this guy having an incredible string of luck is that there must be thousands of people in this casino, and this guy is just the guy that happened to have an incredible string of luck. And that's basically and you would say, well, that's a fallacious argument. Like we haven't seen anybody else in this casino. There's just this one guy. How can you infer the existence of these thousands of other people when we've just seen this one guy having an incredible string of luck? And that is basically the same argument that folks in sort of the fine-tuning sort of anthropic space give for fine-tuning itself. That we happen to be in this universe that's very, very lucky. Therefore, there must be thousands or millions or in a multiverse of other universes where they're just less lucky people. We're the lucky ones. And that's a logical fallacy, right? You do not actually you only have the observational evidence that you have. And there's principles of reasoning, which is, always operate on the most specific evidence that's available to you. The most specific evidence available to us is that this universe is fine-tuned. We have to explain that fact. Appealing to an unobservable distribution of infinite sort of other universes is a logical fallacy, identical to this inverse gambler's fallacy. And so this is, I think an important it's like pure sort of, and philosophers of probability, this is a pretty well-known argument, but it hasn't really translated into the scientific community, which just sort of has this kind of basic intuition that there's either a multiverse, there's many worlds in quantum mechanics, or the string vacua, that we're just lucky. We happen to be lucky. It's just an indexable fact about us. And I think that is committing the same logical fallacy as the inverse gambler's fallacy. And so then you have to then treat the fine-tuning of this universe seriously. You have to actually explain it without appealing to some infinite distribution of other possibilities, and we just happen to find ourselves in this particular one. And the way Philip Goff gives this explanation is actually what explains these parameters, is actually that the universe is evolving over time to achieve certain purposes. We might not be able to currently identify what those purposes are or have a precise formulation of what those purposes are, but appealing to, say, certain, what in philosophy is called sort of teleological principles, that there's a telos to the universe, that the laws exist for a reason, not for some supernatural, some God-given reason, but there is a purpose for the universe itself, that the universe is achieving a certain purpose. He has a particular way of unpacking this in his book, which is that the purpose of the universe is essentially to create more novelty, right? More interestingness, essentially. And this actually, I sort of combine Philip Goff's approach with the folks that created assembly theory. I like to combine that with what I was talking about before in terms of this theory of causation. And then also what I talked about in previous podcasts, the sort of Stephen Wolfram, Jonathan Garrard sort of hypergraph idea. And there's similar views of the world as sort of a process of construction, right? We think about the universe as like this big empty space that's mostly static with a bunch of stuff in it. And so we think, well, why is this sort of empty, sort of big box here? I think the better way to think of the universe is actually like, all of that is constantly changing. It doesn't look like it's changing, but like empty space, the universe, everything is constantly changing. There's no such thing as like a static slice in reality. If you actually look at any given part of reality, it's extremely busy, right? Almost like every level down. There's always something happening. The universe is constantly changing. So this all reduces to, in my view, like the problem of time, right? Like how like the universe isn't the static object. The universe is a process that's unfolding. Right? And so we are observers that see certain parts of that process unfolding, and we give names to different parts of those processes. We call this a chair, we call this a person, we call this a star, et cetera. But like the root of it is just a complicated process that's taking place, a big process of sort of unfolding, right? And so then you have to say, well, then there's all this process happening, right? And what is that process creating, right? What is that process doing, right? At least from our perspective. And the process seems like it's creating structure, right? It's creating more complex objects, right? We're a version of that. We're a part of the universe. We've been created by the universe as a process of construction, right? And this assembly, like we are some of the more interesting objects in the universe, right? So you ask, like, why would aliens come here, right? Like, why would they just come to some random rock around some random star in some random part of the galaxy? And it might be, well, actually, if you view the universe as creating interesting objects, right? And it just takes a lot of time. The universe can't just like snap its fingers. Like we have a particular we have a very high assembly number in the language of assembly theory. Like we've taken 4 billion years to be created, right? Every process from, the prokaryotic soup to us had to happen, right? The time chain of humanity had to like go a long way back in history. And that's a meaningful chunk of the universe's existence, right? Was like the evolution of what is now us and other objects on this planet that are complex living organisms. And that's like probably a relatively rare thing, not super rare in the universe, but like rare enough that it's really interesting, like when it happens. And you would be really interested if you were another similar sort of highly evolved object with a lot of complexity, what we would call intelligence. You would want to study those things. Like we obsessively study other similar objects like us, like dolphins and whales and baboons. It doesn't matter to our civilization. Like we get no real useful knowledge out of that. Maybe on the margins we understand like human origins by studying primates. But like, why are we obsessed with what are whales talking to each other about? Why do we care, right?
Because they communicate in a way that we don't,
yeah.
And we don't understand.
Because there's something fundamentally unique about them, right? There's some sort of process of evolution that is embodied in those physical objects, which we call dolphins, and their brains in particular. And they've evolved a whole pattern of communication, of behavior, of conceptual understanding, right? It's clear that they have some sort of what we would call concepts. We don't understand what those concepts are, but they must have some sort of concepts for family and, outgroup and danger or whatever. They're primitive concepts, but they could be relatively sophisticated. And, we as intelligences on this planet are really interested in trying to study those minds and their patterns of communication. So it seems like very odd to assume that other forms of higher intelligence would not have the same disposition as we do, right? I mean, it seems like a basic natural curiosity, right? That any complex object that's capable of understanding or trying to understand, create models of reality would want to look at other things that might be give it a new sense of perspective, right? The universe is not working from the same template everywhere, right? There might be basic rules that are applied, but those generate almost irreducible complexity. And so you might have, very different path-dependent trajectories to get to advanced, technological civilization.
So if these alien civilizations come from a star system or an evolutionary path that is a billion years ahead of us, and is infinitely more advanced, but has gone through the phase of retired the biological state and has been synthetic computer silicon based for hundreds of millions of years, they might just be interested in that there's a biological creature here. They may not have, their civilization might not have seen biological creatures for any time, might not even remember it, might have evolved so past it. So the interest might be in the biological brain.
I mean, I think from a certain perspective, right, the perspective of assembly theory is that the distinction between a computational intelligence and a biological intelligence is just, it's kind of an artifact, right? Like what matters is this complex pathway of construction that leads to increasing and irreducible complexity that then imbues that object with, maybe novel emergent capabilities, right? Like higher order intelligence, et cetera. And so, you would be interested in studying anything that's as far along that trajectory, as you can observe, right? Those would be clues as to what the universe is doing, right? Like even a higher order intelligence that's been around for a billion years isn't like a god, doesn't know the secret to the future of the universe, right? That's like in my model, everyone is inherently constrained. Doesn't actually have like the omniscience to know, well, what is the universe actually doing? So everyone is going to be, I think everything in this universe is basically facing the same conundrum, which is like, what is the universe doing? Why is it doing it, right? So I think even this future aliens that you have in mind here are fundamentally facing the same existential questions, right? Why are we here, right? They might have much more advanced technology, they might have answers to some of these questions about the nature of consciousness that we don't have, but they're always going to be searching the universe for clues, right? For what's the mystery of existence. I think that's like almost like that's where you go, right? Once you have no more scarcity, in your society, once you can zip around, you can explore the galaxies, got it, great. Like at a certain point though, you're like, well, why are we here? And you're going to be looking for any clues you have. And maybe the only best clues are, what is the universe constructing, right? And what are the maybe patterns that you might be able to discern between the different patterns of complex objects the universe is creating, e.g., human minds as an example. And so but that's just telling one maybe more abstract story. I think you could also tell a story that's more and more tangible for accounting for some of the UAP phenomena that we experience, which is a lot, has a lot more varieties, right? Like that isn't this abstract cosmic searching, right? There seems to be very weird behavior, right, that we are observing here, right? There are specific objects flying around doing very specific things, interfering with nuclear capabilities, potentially engaging with particular parts of our population. Might be medical effects, biological effects, intentional or unintentional. And so, I'm not supposing that the sort of cosmic stance, the sort of larger philosophical line of inquiry is sufficient to like answer the tactical question of like, who is here and why are they here? Right? I think those questions require like as in traditional intelligence, like you actually have to do like a serious collection, right? If there's another actor or set of actors in our environment that are displaying certain behaviors, and you're trying to do two things in intelligence work. You're trying to discern intent and capabilities, right? And capabilities are a little bit easier to discern. Not easy, but relatively easier, because you can measure those things. You can see how fast can they go? What sorts of environments can they engage in? What sorts of platforms are they using? What's the characteristic morphology? What's the material design? What's maybe principles of propulsion are they using? Those are answerable questions, right, in theory, if you have the right data collection and materials to analyze. The question of intent is then a whole separate question, though. And that's probably, much more difficult to answer. Because you might not actually be, when even in traditional geopolitical, context, assessing intent is very hard. Like the biggest question, probably, the top of the priority tasking for the intelligence, for the CIA in particular, is what is President Xi's intention with respect to Taiwan? right? Literally go into his prefrontal cortex and tell me what sorts of thoughts is President Xi having about Taiwan and how are those thoughts changing week to week, month to month, year to year. Like that's what you're essentially trying to get to, right? As an intelligence service. Now, I'd be very surprised if the CIA had the ability to literally read President Xi's mind and discern that intention. So they have to use proxies for that intention. What has he said to his close advisors, right? What sorts of orders has he given? What sorts of capabilities has he instructed his military to have? What sorts of public statements has he given in private and in public to our leaders and other leaders around the world? And you try to create this mosaic that then you, in an intelligence, tradecraft, you say like, this is our current assessment of his intentions with respect to Taiwan. And very, terrestrial human question of intent for one individual is an immensely difficult question for us, right? For the most powerful intelligence apparatus on the planet. So I'm just like setting expectations, right, for ourselves of like, if that is such a difficult problem, and it's clearly at the top of the priority list for our national decision makers and our intelligence community, then let's be somewhat humble about our ability to discern the intentions of some non-human intelligence where we have maybe less direct engagement with, right?
Well, it's like that. You've seen the film Arrival, right?
Yes. Yeah.
I love that film. Like, as we get to, there'll be a bit of a plot. I assume everyone listening has seen it, but there's a bit of a exposed part of the plot here that towards the end of the film that they're confused. They believe the intentions of these aliens is to start war. But war might not be a thing that exists even within, that species of alien, that non-human civilization. And they almost get it completely wrong. They almost declare war on them. And so we're always trying to imagine from our own framework, from our own human framework, our history, our how we've evolved and behaved.
Which is why we need to do a lot of work to come up with other frameworks, right? That's kind of my whole thrust here is you need, a set of frameworks that you put a lot of work into that come from all these different angles. You need to have a good sense of what the limits of current physics are and then be open to potential, maybe more heterodox frontiers of physical theories that are sort of outside the current canonical paradigm in, say, string theory. You need to have models of consciousness that are not maybe purely materialistic computational functionalism. You maybe bring in sort of a version of, say, property dualism or my version of sort of structural dualism.
Well, you can't just
these are
peak.
This is what I was saying before about kind of like putting in consciousness is the root structure of reality, and therefore it will then carry through, propagate into higher order objects. And so even engineered objects could potentially possess consciousness, right? So, for example, then if we're thinking about understanding how these really advanced technologies operate, they might be, a novel synthesis of knowledge both on the structure of physical reality and the nature of consciousness. And in fact, there's certain circumstantial evidence and certain people, pointing in that direction, that the historical sets of U.S. government programs that touched on UAPs also were very close to, sometimes with a lot of overlap in terms of personnel, with all of our sort of weird psychic research, right? Like remote viewing or using pharmaceutical and pharmacological interventions to manipulate consciousness, right, for intelligence purposes or military
purposes. Is this
purposes.
like MK Ultra?
Yeah. So these are all like interrelated government projects for many years. And individuals in those programs that have given statements at various points, pointed to these interrelated mysteries, trying to understand how UAPs function would put them in the direction of trying to understand what consciousness is. And there's been a lot of, like the human brain consciousness is still like a mysterious thing, right? Like the core theory of physics is a theory of, relatively simple systems, right? We model electrons in a condensate or, particles going through a particle accelerator. And we just assume that we mostly assume reductionism, that the laws of physics essentially supervene on all their facts. Meaning, if you just have the story of physics and all the physical facts at the basic level, then all the other high level phenomenon are just determined by that basic level. So phenomenon, behavior of complex objects like minds are very complicated, but fundamentally reducible in terms of basic physical interactions, that we can tell the story in terms of particles and fields. And it's a basic assumption, but it's a philosophical claim. It's not like a scientific paradigm. It's not. We haven't actually tested the behavior of particles in complicated objects like brains. the same way you've tested them in particle accelerators. So there is the possibility of what's called strong emergence in philosophical literature, that there are new laws of physics, new fundamental behaviors, phenomena that can emerge in reality that are not strictly determined by the low-level story that you would tell in terms of the basic physics equations. Now, I'm not saying that's true, but it is an open possibility, and therefore, in the UAP language, there could be aspects of reality. It could be emergent phenomenon, real emergent phenomenon that you can reliably generate if you understand the right configuration of systems to put together and generate novel emergent behavior and emergent capabilities. And that might come along with consciousness. It might come along with other things, right? And that might be what remote viewing is looking at, right? Like, it certainly violates a lot of our inbuilt physicalist assumptions about locality.
You should explain what remote viewing is, because not everyone will know.
Yeah, and this is part of this whole sort of, we have constructed a sort of folk model of reality that puts these things as sort of psychic woo sorts of stuff. And of course, there's all sorts of communities of practice that spin, tales of spirituality and sort of, hucksterism and frauds and that sorts of thing. But like the core story, though, is that the U.S. government has for decades and still does to this day use remote viewing as an intelligence piece of tradecraft. And they don't say that because it gets like weird looks, but in the U.S. government, it's like if it works, it works, right? They try not to understand why it works. I mean, maybe they've looked into it. I'm sure they have, but at a certain level, if some guy can basically tell you there's a secret nuclear sub being built in some warehouse, in Kamchatka, and our spy satellites can't see it. There's no intelligence tradecraft that we have that determines what that is, but he says, yeah, it's there. And then 6 months goes by, and then a big new nuclear sub rolls out. Okay. As an intelligence customer, you go, I don't know how you knew that. I don't know what principles of the universe explained how that guy was able to tell me that information, but it was true.
Could that not be coincidence?
Yeah, I mean, so this is I don't have like high confidence in the exact performance of remote viewing as an intelligence trading craft. I just know that it's something the U.S. government has like objectively used. Right?
But remote viewing is people essentially like using meditative techniques, like closing their eyes and visualizing things.
Yeah, I mean, there's a whole story here about like psychic spies that goes back to like Russell Targ and Hal Puthoff and SRI, and there's all these experiments the CIA brought them in to do. They trained a bunch of remote viewers. Lou Elizondo in his book describes how when he was recruited as a member of Special Forces, he was recruited into a particular program that codenamed Gray Fox, and he has that codename in the book, and that codename went through Defense Office of Pre-Publication Security Review. So I can say Gray Fox. I'm surprised to see that in the book, but like it's been known that Gray Fox refers to an element of the U.S. Special Operations community that's among the more select, like elite groups, right? So Delta Force, people know about. SEAL Team 6, people know about. This group, Gray Fox, is like equivalent to that in terms of its selection, selectivity, but it specializes in doing sort of behind enemy lines, close reconnaissance, preparation of the battlefield, very small unit teams, maybe 1-man, 2-man teams, doing deniable covert operations. So Lou Elizondo was recruited into that group. The main his primary recruiter, who brought him into that group, talks about in his book, trained him in remote viewing as well. So he recruited him into this very select elite special operations unit and trained him in remote viewing as a tactical skill, right? Essentially to use it to plan missions, to understand if there are booby traps, to locate hostages, right? This is the functional application of this capability. He was never told how it works or why it works. It was just, you are now part of this program. We're going to train you in these certain visualization techniques that you will use as planning missions and conducting operations to keep you alive, keep your teammates alive. And that's as far as Lou cared to understand it. He's just, okay, this is what the U.S. government's going to tell me to do. I'm going to do it. If it works, it saves lives, I'm going to keep doing it. And so this is where, people scoff and they go, well, this is pseudoscience. This is, and again, that usually comes from a certain core functionalist, physicalist assumption, a certain basic mental model of reality that's like fundamentally local, deterministic, et cetera. That's kind of the inbuilt, worldview people have. And I just think that's probably not correct, right? I just think we know from separate strands and the limits of frontier physics and where we think philosophy of mind is pointing us at that there's, gaps in that physicalist paradigm. And that's saying that gap, is where, say, remote viewing fits, but at least open space for it to exist in a way that doesn't that I think should prevent someone from just quickly just dismissing it as some flight of bureaucratic fancy, some spiritualist ideologues inside the government kind of got gripped by some delusion and kept perpetuating this $1 million grift for many decades.
Is it because the skeptics are skeptical because of the limitations of their own ability? But if we look into the way whales and dolphins communicate with each other, they have a different way of seeing the world, and potentially there are some humans who have an ability to tap into something to see the world in a different way. Is this even is this a quantum thing as well? Could this be a tool, like a quantum tool the brain has?
I mean, people usually, anything sort of mysterious and woo,
blame quantum.
They sort of just go, it's quantum, it's a quantum thing. And I think that's just kind of like most physicists, that's where they kind of have a revulsion or an aversion to this sort of topic, because they go, oh, these people aren't serious, they're not rigorous. Like, quantum is just a deterministic set of equations. The Schrodinger equation, there's no woo or mystery in the Schrodinger equation. It's just, this is the Hamiltonian function, this is how it's evolving, this is it.
But it's got to be either spiritual or scientific.
Where I was pointing at is maybe an in-between, which is a naturalistic account of reality where the world isn't purely physicalist in the sense that it's not a purely deterministic set of physical states that evolve according to a mathematical equation, right? That's a valuable model for certain aspects of reality, but there are other aspects of reality that set of models do not properly account for, and that you can bring other phenomena, including conscious phenomenon, which are just as real, just a different type of phenomenon, into a naturalistic framework that doesn't require an appeal to some supernatural authority, but isn't just purely reductionist. That's kind of like where I want to sort of, I want to position myself in that sort of space. And in that world, there is space for these sorts of things, either strong emergence, right, or where you might have, for example, if a version of the story is true, evolution would have a strong selection pressure, where if it was possible to pick up on, say, non-local sources of information, that there'd be like a strong selection pressure, right, to like use that for survival, right? It wouldn't be necessarily useful for predicting like the lottery, right? Evolution wouldn't have selected for that specific kind of like, I'm going to predict the lottery numbers tomorrow, but like intuition, like built in, that would alert you to danger ahead of time would be a very strong selection effect, right? So you can imagine that this might have been, much more manifest in early hominids before we developed, systems of planning and language and forecasting and prediction about the weather or whatever. And this was just a survival mechanism. And it became much more attenuated as we became, agrarian settled civilizations. And it just became less useful it became like a vestige, right? Because we don't need to like always be on the alert for, danger. And it might be reason why it's most manifest and then sort of regenerated in special operations communities, because those guys are the few elements of modern human civilization that their daily life is much more like hunter-gatherers, right? They're constantly in environments of danger where they have to leverage all their senses for survival. And so whatever inbuilt sort of maybe latent capabilities that are just evolved parts of our apparatus, could be amplified and then trained to be amplified. That's like pretty natural explanation of why it would be associated with these programs.
So philosophically with that, then could it be that consciousness isn't a siloed, isolated experience? Consciousness is a macro experience.
Yeah. Now we're getting real, like, hit the shrooms, whatever.
Yeah.
Because actually Philip Goff goes in this exact direction in his book, Why, that I was pointing at. He motivates essentially like, what is the telos of the universe? Well, it's actually, there's sort of a universal mind, right? That is essentially, if the universe itself is this conscious process, right? There's a way of speaking about that as like essentially what he calls cosmopsychism, right? So there's two different ways you could do. You could put consciousness as like proto-consciousness, very like the what it is like to be an electron is like extremely attenuated. There's like no real, it's not a complex experience like we have. It's like the most rudimentary flicker of like experience is like built into the basic sort of building blocks of reality as it's sort of computing itself and constructing state, sort of the future. And then there's like, okay, the set of all of those processes taken together, is there a way of speaking about that as a as essentially a more metaphysical unity, and if every constituent part of it has some consciousness, does the whole have consciousness? He gives an argument that motivates a kind of cosmopsychism. I'm ambivalent right now about that particular thesis. I think, I don't know, it has some merit, but I'm not ready to endorse it entirely. But that would be a way of speaking about reality that's, I think, appeals to both kind of the folks that are maybe more theistically or spiritually inclined without biting the full bullet of like a supernatural deity that stands outside of space and time and has its own, abstruse purposes and plans. Then we stand in some sort of like subject-object relationship between, normal human, spiritual, conscious existence and some supernatural existence. That we're just a part of the universe. The universe is a thing. We are a thing that has consciousness. The universe is a thing that has consciousness, right? That's basically just a naturalistic story. Then there is more of like this spiritual component would be, or moral component would be, do we have any way of contributing to the purposes that the universe has? Like, do conscious beings have purposes? We are a conscious being. We have purposes. We live our lives to achieve those purposes, basically. If you say the universe has purposes, the universe is constructing itself to achieve those purposes. There's a version of this argument where those purposes are entirely orthogonal, right? In fact, we get no meaning there's no relationship between our purposes and cosmic purpose, right? So you could believe the universe has a cosmic purpose and still believe that human life is meaningless, right? So I'm not saying that like this is where it's distinction between like a traditional theistic view where like there's a God's purpose and human lives are part of God's purpose. That's sort of usually the traditional religious worldview. This view doesn't, necessarily imply that. You could construct a version of this argument where the cosmic purpose or sets of purposes can be contributed to in some way through the execution of human will, right? And in that way, he sort of tells, this is Philip Goff's argument, he's like, that would make human life sort of marginally more meaningful, right? He thinks that even if they weren't connected to cosmic purpose, I can still have a meaningful life. I can have purposes that I can achieve. I can have meaningful relationships. I can pursue projects. Those projects can succeed. I can be happy about it, etc. I think, he tells the story, but if some of my purposes and the ways that I can execute them can contribute even marginally to cosmic purpose, say through the creation of more interesting, complex objects, more creativity in the universe, whatever, then that makes my life, marginally more meaningful. And so it is a, useful philosophical pursuit to try to paint this type of picture, that if you can motivate cosmic purposes and you can see if you can connect human purposes to those cosmic purposes, then human life actually would be marginally more meaningful. And I think this is part of maybe rekindling a sense of purpose in reality that has sort of been stripped away by sort of the last several hundred years of kind of physicalist, very successful modern scientific paradigm, which is just reducing all the patterns of reality into, quantum fields, right? That there's just a bunch of equations that describe the stuff does the stuff that does the things the equations say they do. Human beings are just emergent, higher level phenomenon. But fundamentally, everything we do reduces to those deterministic physical processes. And that's a kind of an empty, purposelessness or purposeless view of reality. And it's very much rejected by folks that have a more spiritual, religious orientation that want to say, no, human life is meaningful, and God's purpose is imbued in my existence. A lot of folks don't want to bite all of those metaphysical bullets. And so I like this. This is sort of a nice like middle ground, right? Like you can sort of paint a naturalistic view,
like it.
And it's like you don't have to go either way, right? And maybe that's like I tend to go the middle way.
Well, I often think about the probability of existence, of personal existence. So I kind of like work it back, and I say, okay, I'm here, I'm alive today. I'm having this conversation, so I've survived 45 years, but my existence came from the time mum and dad wanted to have a little party with mum, and my existence came into being. If they'd have done it a day later, an hour later, the day before, do I come to exist? Am I just the manifestation of that moment of time? If I am, then you go backwards and go, well, their parents and their parents and their parents. You go all the way through human evolution. You go back through apes. You go back through to the dinosaurs. If there was never a meteor that hit, would that have happened? All the way back to that 4 billion year path we've been through, and and previous to that 4 billion years, like the emergence of our galaxy, and like the probability of being alive is your odds of being alive is so small, it's ridiculous.
Yeah,
but also in that timeline of 13.8 billion years of observable universe, we're in that tiny little, maybe 70, 75 year period I get to live, hopefully. And so I look at those two, the odds of those, they're so small. They're so ridiculously small. That's the only thing that makes me slightly spiritual, is I think, oh, well, perhaps I'm always alive, because we're always alive, because there is a single consciousness. That's the only thing that makes me spiritual.
Yeah, I again, as a rationalist, I try to anchor these metaphysical beliefs in some sort of picture that I can have reasons to believe in, as opposed to just the pure existential, anxiety relief, right? Like, people want to believe that there's life after that. They want to believe consciousness survives, biological decay, right? These are things we would want to be true. And I very much strongly would want those to be true as well. But I have to rationally approach the question and, not load the dice, right, with my, psychological desire, right? And I don't have, obviously, I don't have the answer for life, the universe, meaning of everything, right? I'm not going to be that hubristic here, despite, whatever random claims I've made in the last few hours. But I think this does point us in this interesting direction, which is trying to think about consciousness as not, if you follow me in terms of thinking, consciousness is fundamental to reality, especially the complex manifestation of consciousness in higher order structured objects that have this long assembly path, and the universe is constructing those objects, right, into an unknown future, right? The universe is not predetermined, and that there's a certain what we think of as who you are and what your conscious entity essentially is a pattern of information that's structured in a subset of the universe at any given moment, right? And it's being destroyed and recreated at each new moment, right? And so, you as an object exists in the universe. The universe has created it. That object could cease to exist in some future state. That's fine. That seems perfectly reasonable, right? But that's just the way it is, right? You were a part of the universe. Great. Clap yourself on the back, right? You had a meaningful, you were part of something, right? You don't necessarily need to survive, in some sort of afterlife with, a Red Bull, right? That's a different, this is a unique aspect of consciousness manifesting in Peter, right? And if the manifestation of consciousness that we call Peter goes away in 50 years, that's fine. But consciousness as part of the universe is going to keep reproducing objects that manifest interesting versions of that in the future. It might not be Peter. That's okay. Do you want to be Peter forever? Probably not, right? So I think we just had to be this more Buddhist kind of orientation, just who you are, not be so attached to this particular manifestation of consciousness, right? That it's wrapped up in my ego, my identity. A lot of the meditative or contemplative traditions are about, or even sort of drug cultures is about reducing the ego, right? Breaking the ego down, the kind of higher order configurations of personal identity, who I am, my life plans, my goals. Sort of strip those away, and you just get this sort of, bare field of awareness, this bare sort of subjective state of being. And that's, in philosophy, Heidegger, that would be sort of, Dasein, right? Sort of being itself. That's what it is. That's what it is to be a creature or a being in the world. And that's just that's gonna be a temporary thing. That's fine. That's where I am, right? It's I don't the higher order structured of Matt as a temporary thing. That's fine. I wouldn't want that to be forever, right? I think also this is sort of this cultural obsession we have with immortality. You see this people want to live forever. Good. I think it's good to have longer lives. I think the desire to live forever, though, is a pathology, right?
I'm not sure people so much want to live forever. I think they don't want to die. It's more of a short-term thing rather than a long-term perception. I want to live forever. I don't want to die tomorrow. Mm-hmm. I don't want to die in 10 years. Maybe I'll accept I'll die in 20, 30 years. But as you get nearer, you still don't want to die.
There's a certain strain of belief, though, that I see that has a lot of wealthy, powerful adherents right now, kind of techno-extropianism. And it's sort of often aligned with a kind of effective accelerationist view of artificial intelligence that, it usually either combines this idea that we can upload human minds to the computer, and then we can design computers to take over the universe, right? And then they see this whole, the canard is the future light cone of humanity is at stake in our present, political discourse around regulating AI, basically, right? That's sort of the stakes they've leveraged in this debate, is that we will soon create an artificial superintelligence that will be conscious, will have moral and ethical value, and in fact, from certain communities of belief, will actually have more ethical and moral value because it's going to be much more conscious, much more intelligent, much more capable than we are. And in fact, our imprint in the future will be basically will be the result of creating this artificial superintelligence. It will be our cosmic endowment, and so we need to stand in relation to it as like a parent giving birth to a godchild that will then needs to be aligned with us, and to ensure that our moral attitudes and beliefs about the good will carry through into its indefinite future as it replicates and colonizes the universe. This is like the dominant, I'd say, worldview among some of the most powerful elite figures driving our technological paradigm now. Like the heads of the frontier model AI labs, some very wealthy individuals believe this, right? They actually believe that speciesist, you're being racist against the human species if you I think Sergey Brin is famous for saying this to Elon. When Elon was basically saying, why are you, recklessly pursuing artificial general intelligence, like could lead to the extinction of humanity. Sergey's retort was, "Oh, you're just being specious. Like you're prioritizing, the transient human species over this much more, powerful, almost godlike intelligence that we could create that will be able to pursue much more meaningful projects in the universe. And that's really the purpose of humanity, is to create that. And if we, like a ladder that gets climbed can be sort of thrown away. I don't know. I think that's a pretty radical set of beliefs but it's downstream of some of these basic, maybe less controversial ideas, right? If you believe, consciousness can be replicated in a computational substrate, and if you believe, intelligence is just kind of this spectrum of complexity, then yeah, and you believe that then those are, have moral value, well, then we would sort of stand in a much more inferior moral and intelligent relationship with respect to these systems. And that could have practical political effects, right? Because it's like, if these people have wealth and power and they see this as like a moral mission for themselves, they could use that wealth and power to, constrain or to limit the ability of national governments to constrain their activities. So this is where I think, these philosophical debates around the nature of consciousness, intelligence, complexity sound abstract, but they inhere very practically in our policy questions about AI, about synthetic biology, about UAPs. So these are all going to become interlinked in the next 5-10 years, I think. That these sort of philosophical questions, we're going to have to put stakes in the ground, motivate those, and debate and fight for a certain picture of the world that we think is true. And right now, there's a certain set of attitudes that are pushing us in a certain direction. Ironically, you have, it's kind of funny to me that like this policy question and this philosophical question and technical question about the potential future emergence of artificial superintelligence is like fully within the Overton window now, right? You have senators getting briefed on it. It's kind of like, the big debate in Silicon Valley and San Francisco is like bringing about the AGI God, and we're close, and when is superintelligence going to emerge, and billions of dollars of capital being spent building this hyperscale cloud and training clusters. People have fully accepted this as like, a live possibility could happen in the next 3 to 5 years. What would be the disruptions to society if we created such a system? Fully normalized part of the discourse now is this, what was previously considered this sort of wild internet fringe belief that you could create, a supermind. And I think UAPs are like not part of that conversation, but they absolutely probably have more evidence in their favor in terms of the U.S. government's been studying this for a long time. There's parts of the U.S. government that like have zero doubt, quote unquote, that non-human intelligence exists. Non-human intelligence has been interacting with humanity. This interaction has been long going, and government officials are aware of that fact. What I just said was quoted by retired Colonel Carl Nell, who helped draft the UAP Disclosure Act. So we're in this weird state of cognitive dissonance, in my view, where a subject that is taboo, that shouldn't be, right? That's like very real and very serious for a large portion of the security apparatus, but hasn't diffused into the public consciousness. UAPs, sort of being, it's slowly moving in, but it's still kind of marginalized as sort of a taboo fringe subject. Whereas the idea of artificial general intelligence, artificial superintelligence is fully normalized, is the basis for billions and billions of dollars of capital investment, very high level strategic policy discussions. We're actually leveraging a lot of this as part of our motivation for constraining China's technological development, blocking their access to advanced semiconductor manufacturing equipment. So it's having like practical effects. But there's no high confidence consensus or belief that we're actually going to create a artificial superintelligence like anytime soon. It's looking at a bunch of scaling curves and just extrapolating out. A bunch of just like a chart of like more compute, more capability, just draw the line up, and therefore AGI God, right? Meanwhile, there's folks inside the government that have craft materials, biological materials that have been studying this for decades. Most people aren't aware of that fact. And we're making pretty strategic policy decisions and having normal debates around this artificial superintelligence question and having a serious discussion. And we're sort of snickering at this UAP question. I'm like, guys, like
same thing.
This is these should maybe they are. I mean, separate question of the ASI question is whether it is as serious as it should be. I think it's a serious question, but like the UAP question is just as probably more important than that question. And so that's all I'm just like. These are all important questions. They're all going to converge into our public discourse and our policy discourse in the next few years. And you just don't want to be surprised.
Well, and equally, this might all just be one giant fluke. We're completely meaningless and we will die and it doesn't matter.
It will matter. It will matter to you. It may not matter to the universe.
It only matters to the people around you who love you.
That's all that matters.
Yeah, it doesn't matter to yourself. That's why, in some ways, it's probably better to believe in God because if there's no God, it doesn't matter. You wouldn't know.
It's good to believe in purpose. I think it's good to believe the universe has a purpose and that you can contribute to that purpose.
So anything we've not covered, we should have.
I mean, there's so much.
I know.
There's so much.
I was like, this could be a 14-hour episode. You got to get a flight, haven't you?
Pretty soon. Yeah.
I think we should call it quits there. That was fucking insane. And thank you for coming here and doing this into our new studio.
Congratulations, Bai. This is a pretty sweet setup.
Way, I said when you were in the toilet, I said the most challenging part of this interview is trying to move it along smoothly when you only understand half of it.
You understood half?
What?
You understood half?
Yeah, I'm kind of smart.
Smart guy. I understood half what I say too.
Matt, thank you so much. Appreciate you so much. And I'm sure there will be a follow-up. Thank you to everyone listening. See you later.
Thank you.